Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm glad you're here tonight. Find somewhere comfortable if you can. Maybe you are listening from bed, maybe from a chair after a long day, maybe from a room that still has a little noise in it, the hum of a refrigerator, the soft push of heat through a vent, a car moving somewhere outside. Tonight we're going into a different kind of noise. Not the noise of a battlefield, not the shouting of a crowd in front of a palace, not the grand speeches of inventors, politicians, or wealthy men standing beside machines they did not have to operate themselves. We're going into the ordinary workday of the industrial age. The kind of day that began before the sun was fully up, ended after the body had already given everything it could, and repeated again the next morning with very little ceremony. We are not going to look at industry from the top, from the polished office, or the factory owner's house, or the pages of a business ledger. We're going to walk through it at ground level, with the people who heard the bell, tied their boots, packed a little food if they had any, and stepped into a world where time no longer belonged to the sun, the field, the season, or the household. It belonged to the clock. That one change may sound simple, but it altered daily life more deeply than almost anything else about the modern world. Before industrial labour became common, most working people still worked hard, often brutally hard, but their days were tied to tasks that could be seen and measured by the body. A field had to be ploughed, grain had to be cut, animals had to be fed, cloth had to be spun, bread had to be baked. There was no easy life for ordinary people before factories, and I do not want to romanticise it. A farm labourer in the 1700s could be exhausted in ways that would humble almost anyone living today. But the industrial age introduced something different. It took work out of the flexible disorder of daylight and weather and placed it inside buildings where bells, whistles, overseers, clocks, machines, and wages determined the shape of a day. The worker did not begin when the rooster crowed and the sky lightened. The worker began when the factory required it. If the bell rang at 5, the day began at 5. If the gate closed at 6, being 1 minute late could cost part of your pay or all of your job. So before we enter the mill, before we stand beside the spinning frames or the iron furnace or the long row of machines that shook the floorboards beneath the workers' feet, we need to begin where the workday actually began. Not in the factory, not at the machine, at home, in the cold, in the dark, in a room that probably held too many people and too little air. Because the typical industrial workday did not begin with labour. It began with waking up tired. Picture a textile town in northern England around the middle of the 1800s, or a mill town in New England not long after, or a crowded industrial district in Scotland, France, Belgium, or Pennsylvania. The exact street changes, the language changes, the food changes, the shape of the houses changes a little, but the beginning of the day is familiar across all of them. It is still dark. The room is not quiet because working-class housing in industrial towns was rarely quiet. There may be coughing from another bed, a baby shifting in a cradle or drawer, someone moving on a straw mattress, the sound of boots scraping the floor, water being poured into a basin, a match being struck if the family has matches, or someone coaxing a small fire back into life if there are still coals left from the night before. In many homes there is damp on the walls. In some there is a smell of coal smoke that never fully leaves. The windows, if there are windows, may be small, and if the house is in a crowded court or alley, the view outside is not open. Sky but brick, mud, washing lines, drains, and the backs of other houses pressed close enough that privacy is more of a hope than a fact. The worker waking in that room might be a man, but it might just as easily be a woman, a teenage girl, a boy of 12, or a child younger than that in the earlier decades of industrialization. The industrial age did not only employ strong adult men with lunch pails and heavy boots, it drew entire households into wage labour. In textile districts especially, women and children formed a huge part of the workforce because machines needed nimble hands as much as they needed strength, and because employers could pay women and children less. For a poor family, that did not always feel like a choice. If rent was due, if bread prices had risen, if the father's work was irregular, if the mother's wages were the difference between eating and not eating, then the factory became part of family survival. This is one of the hardest things to sit with, honestly. Industrial labour was dangerous, exhausting, and often unfair, but it also offered wages. Small wages, uncertain wages, wages that could be reduced by fines or lost through illness, but still wages. To families living close to the edge, that mattered. The first sensation of the day was often cold. Not always, of course. In summer, the air in industrial housing could become close and sour, especially where several people slept in one room. But for much of the year in Britain, Northern Europe and the northeastern United States, morning meant cold boards underfoot, cold water on the face, cold fingers trying to fasten clothing stiff from wear. Clothing itself tells you a great deal about the workday before it even starts. A factory worker did not dress for comfort in the modern sense. He or she dressed in what was available, what had been mended, what could survive dirt, sparks, grease, oil, dust, and long hours. A man might pull on rough trousers, a shirt, braces, a waistcoat or jacket depending on the season, and heavy boots if he had them. A woman might dress in a plain gown or skirt and bodice, with an apron, shawl, and sometimes a cap or scarf to keep hair back from machinery. That detail was not decorative. Loose hair near machinery could be deadly. In cotton mills and other factories, moving parts did not forgive a moment's inattention. The machine did not know whether it had caught thread, cloth, hair, or flesh. It simply kept moving. Breakfast, if there was breakfast, was usually plain and fast. Bread, porridge, oatcakes, potatoes, tea, coffee, or something left from the previous day. In Britain, tea became one of the great working-class supports of the industrial era, not because it was elegant, but because it was warm, stimulating, and could make poor food feel more like a meal. In some places, workers drank weak beer, especially earlier in the period, though tea became increasingly common. A child sent to the mill might eat quickly while still half asleep. A mother might prepare food for others while also preparing herself for work. A father might leave first if his workplace was farther away. There was very little of the calm morning routine we imagine today, the kind where someone stands at a counter and thinks about the day ahead. For many industrial workers, the morning was a controlled scramble. Get up, dress, eat what can be eaten, make sure the younger ones are moving, wrap or carry food for later if there is any. Leave before the bell makes leaving pointless, and that bell matters. It is one of the central sounds of the industrial age. Church bells had marked time for communities for centuries, but the factory bell was different. It did not call people to worship, warn of danger, or mark a town celebration. It summoned labour. In some industrial towns, bells and whistles divided the entire day into pieces. Wake, arrive, begin, stop, return, begin again, end. The sound carried through streets where hundreds or thousands of people were making the same calculation at the same moment. How far to the gate? How much time left? Can I still make it? What happens if I do not? Think about your own mornings for a moment. What time did you wake up today? Did you choose it? Or did a sound choose it for you? An alarm on your phone, a child in the next room, a message, a job waiting, a body that has learned its schedule too well. Now imagine that the sound pulling you out of sleep is not just reminding you to start your day. It is connected directly to your ability to buy bread. That is what the factory bell meant. It turned minutes into money, and it turned lateness into punishment. Some factories docked wages for tardiness. Some locked the gates after the starting time. Some used fines for small violations, and those fines could be deeply resented because the workers' pay was already thin. A few minutes lost at the beginning of a day could become a visible absence at the end of the week, when wages were counted and debts were waiting. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like slowing down and looking at the ordinary parts of history that do not always get a place in school books, it would mean a great deal if you subscribed and gave the video a like. You do not have to do it right this second. Do it when the story settles in, when some small detail makes the past feel a little closer than it did before. And if you want to, tell me where you're listening from tonight. A city, a country, a couch, a kitchen, a night shift break room, a quiet bed with the lights already low. I always like knowing where these stories are landing, because history feels different when you remember that someone is hearing it in a real room, in a real life, after their own real day. Now let's return to that worker standing in the doorway before dawn. The air outside is not fresh in the way we might imagine early morning air. In many industrial towns it is already touched by smoke. Coal smoke from household fires, coal smoke from furnaces, coal smoke from factory chimneys that darken brick, settled on windows, stained clothes, and entered lungs so gradually that many people simply accepted it as part of the weather. In some districts, the sky itself seemed changed by industry. Visitors to Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Glasgow, Pittsburgh and other industrial centres often wrote about smoke, soot, noise, and the dense concentration of people. To the people who lived there, the smoke was not scenery. It was laundry that would not stay clean, throats that burned, children coughing, and daylight made dimmer than it should have been. The streets before work could be crowded. Men and women moved in the same direction, some talking, some silent, some still waking up as they walked. Children hurried beside older siblings or neighbours. In mill towns, the sound of clogs on stone or brick pavement became part of the morning. In mining districts, men might walk toward the pit with lamps and tools. In iron towns, workers moved toward furnaces that had been burning while others slept, because some kinds of industrial work did not truly stop. The furnace did not care about the household clock. The mine did not become safe because a man was tired. The machine did not become gentle because a child was small. There is an important distinction here. The phrase industrial age can make it sound as if everyone worked in the same kind of place, doing the same kind of labour. They did not. A cotton spinner's day in a Lancashire mill was not the same as a coal miner's day in Wales or Pennsylvania. A match factory worker in London did not live the same workday as a steel worker in Pittsburgh, a seamstress in New York, a child piecer in a spinning room, a railway worker, a dock labourer, a pottery worker, or a woman taking in laundry at home while also caring for children. But there were patterns that repeated across industrial life. Long hours, low wages for many, strict discipline, dangerous tools and machines, crowded housing near work, a new dependence on clocks, a constant fear of injury, illness, unemployment, and hunger. And above all, the feeling that the day belonged to someone else once the worker crossed the factory gate. Before the gate, there was still a little personal life left. A worker could adjust a scarf, finish a bite of bread, wipe a child's face, speak to a neighbour, complain about the cold, look at the sky, or say nothing at all. After the gate, the rules changed. The body entered a space designed for production. That is a plain sentence, but it is worth staying with. The factory was not built around comfort, family, sunlight, conversation, or rest. It was built to produce goods efficiently. Cloth, thread, iron, tools, paper, matches, shoes, glass, machinery, rails, nails, rope, cigarettes, canned food, and 1,000 other things that filled the modern world. The worker's body had to fit into that design. Hands had to move at the machine's pace. Feet had to stand where the work required. Eyes had to watch for breaks, jams, sparks, flaws, signals, overseers, and danger. Ears had to learn what a machine sounded like when it was running correctly, and what it sounded like when something was wrong. In many factories, conversation was difficult or impossible because of the noise. In others, conversation was forbidden or discouraged because talk was thought to slow production. This is where the industrial age becomes very different from the older rhythms of work. On a farm, a tired worker might slow down. though not always without consequence. In a domestic workshop, a craftsperson might control parts of the process, choosing the pace within the limits of need and daylight. In a factory, the machine set the tempo. A spinning mule, a power loom, a press, a rolling mill, a conveyor, a pump, a furnace line, each created its own demand. The worker did not merely use the machine. The worker attended it, fed it, cleared it, watched it, repaired small interruptions, repeated the same motions until they lived in the muscles and joints. That repetition could be efficient for production and punishing for the human body. Fingers cracked, backs bent, knees swelled, hearing diminished, lungs filled with dust, eyes strained in dim light or harsh glare, skin burned, toughened, blistered, healed, and blistered again. One of the easiest mistakes to make when talking about this period is to treat the workers as passive victims of machines, as if they simply wandered into history and were swallowed by iron. They were not passive. They were skilled in ways that are often hard for us to see now. A child piecer in a cotton mill, whose job was to mend broken threads while machines were moving, needed speed, attention, and nerve. A mule spinner understood the behaviour of cotton, humidity, tension, and machinery through long practice. A miner read the underground world through sound, smell, pressure, and experience. An ironworker knew heat not as an idea, but as something judged by colour, timing, and risk. A seamstress working by the piece had to be fast, accurate, and disciplined, even when paid so little that every pause hurt. Industrial labour often reduced people, but the people themselves were not simple. They carried knowledge in their hands, backs, eyes, and habits. Still, skill did not mean power. That is the hard line running through so much of this history. Workers knew things. Workers made things. Workers kept the industrial world moving. But the factory owner, manager, overseer, contractor, or system usually held the stronger position. If work was scarce, a complaint could cost employment. If a worker was injured, replacement might be easier than compensation. If a family depended on a child's wages, keeping that child out of the factory was not always possible, even for parents who hated sending them. Reformers later wrote about child labour with outrage, and they were right to do so, but the parents of those children were not usually villains. They were often trapped inside an economy where every wage counted. A child's few shillings, pennies, cents, or francs might help pay rent or buy food. That is what poverty does. It turns what should be unthinkable into a calculation made at the kitchen table. So the day begins with more than a walk to work. It begins with a whole set of pressures that have already entered the worker's body before any machine starts. Rent, food, coal, clothing, debt at the shop, a sick child, a spouse out of work, a season of layoffs, a fear that the mill might reduce hours or increase them, or replace workers with newer machinery. Industrial work promised progress to nations and profit to owners, and it did create goods in quantities earlier generations could hardly have imagined. It made cloth cheaper, railways possible, cities larger, newspapers wider, tools more available, and eventually helped create the conditions for modern life. But for the worker at the gate, progress was not a slogan. It was a shift that had to be survived. The factory yard in the morning might smell of oil, coal, wet wool, cotton dust, hot metal, horse manure, damp clothing, and human breath. The buildings themselves could be imposing, sometimes several stories high, with rows of windows and brick walls that seemed permanent, as if they had always been there and always would be. In textile mills, the windows were important because light mattered, especially before reliable electric lighting. Gaslight later extended the working day in some places, which sounds like an improvement until you realise that more light could simply mean more hours. In many mills, heat and humidity were maintained because cotton thread behaved better in certain conditions, even if the workers did not. The room could feel close, damp, and full of fibres. Workers inhaled what the machines released. Ventilation, when present, was often inadequate. The goal was not a healthy atmosphere. The goal was production. A worker entering that space might hang up a shawl or coat, take a position, check a machine, receive instructions, or step immediately into a task already waiting. In some industries, shifts overlapped. In others, one group replaced another. The start of the day could be sudden. The quiet before the machines began, if there was one, would not last. Once the power engaged, the building changed character. Belts moved, shafts turned, looms struck, wheels spun, hammers fell, steam engines thudded, the floor vibrated, the air filled. The human voice became smaller. Imagine standing in a room where sound is not something you hear, but something that presses against you. That is how many workers spent 12 hours or more. And yet, because people are people in every century, the workday was not made only of suffering. This is important too. Workers formed friendships. They joked when they could. They learned one another's habits. They watched for danger together. Older workers taught younger ones how not to lose fingers, how to avoid an overseer's anger, how to pace the body when the day was too long. Women in mills created social worlds around work, sharing news, courtship, complaints, songs, and strategies. Children, even in harsh conditions, found moments of play at the edges of discipline. Men in mines and metalworks developed bonds built on risk. Work could be exploitative and still be a place where human connection survived. That is one reason this history matters. It was not a simple picture of misery from morning to night. It was a full human world under pressure. By the time the first hour had passed, the worker's earlier life that morning, the cold floor, the quick breakfast, the walk through smoke might already feel far away. The body had entered the rhythm of the job. Reach, lift, tie, cut, pull, watch, step, carry, turn, feed, clear, repeat. The mind might wander if the task allowed it, but not too far. A wandering mind near machinery could be dangerous. Some workers counted time by the clock. Others counted it by tasks completed, carts filled, bobbins changed, seams sewn, loads carried, or the slow movement toward the next break. The day ahead was long enough that thinking about the end of it too early could be discouraging. It was better to think in smaller pieces. Get to breakfast if the factory allowed one. Get to dinner. Get to the afternoon. Get to the bell. Get home. The word typical hides a great deal, but there is a reason we use it. A typical workday in the industrial age was not typical because every worker shared the same job. It was typical because millions of lives became organised around the same hard structure. Wake early, leave tired, arrive on time, submit to the clock, labour under supervision, eat quickly, return to the machine, mine, furnace, bench, yard, or shop. Work until released, carry the body home, sleep, repeat. It is a structure that many people today still recognise, though the buildings, laws, wages, protections and machines have changed. That recognition is part of what makes this history feel close. We are not separate from it by as much as we think. The alarm clock beside your bed, the time clock, the shift schedule, the commute, the lunch break, the weekend, the argument over hours, the fear of being late, the idea that your life is divided into paid time and your time, all of these have roots in the world we're entering tonight. Outside the factory, the town is fully awake now. Smoke rises, carts move, shopkeepers open doors, children not yet old enough for work or lucky enough not to be sent appear in doorways. Women who work at home begin their own long day of washing, sewing, cooking, taking in laundry, caring for children, keeping lodgers, or stretching wages that never stretch far enough. Industry did not end domestic labour. It often added wage labour on top of it. For many women, the workday had two halves, one recognised by wages and one assumed by everyone. A woman might spend 12 hours in a mill and still come home to food preparation, cleaning, mending, childcare, and the emotional work of holding a household together. A man might come home ruined by labour and still be expected to represent authority or provide stability. Children might come home too tired to play, or might play anyway because childhood has a way of pushing through even when history gives it very little room. But we are not home yet. We are still at the beginning. The machines have started, the doors are closed, the morning light is finding its way through dirty windows, and the worker is now inside the industrial day. This is where the real shape of the work begins to show itself. The first hours are not only about effort, they're about adjustment. The eyes adjust to motion, the ears adjust to noise, the hands remember what they are supposed to do. The overseer begins moving through the room. A belt slips, a thread breaks, a cart needs loading. Someone coughs and keeps working. Someone glances at the clock and wishes they had not. The day is underway, and the hardest part is not always the danger, though the danger is real. The hardest part is that nothing about the machine suggests it knows or cares that a human being is standing beside it. Before the worker reaches the machine, there is the walk. That part is easy to overlook because it does not show up in most factory records. Ledgers tell us when workers were paid. Parliamentary reports tell us how many hours they were employed. Reformers wrote down injuries, wages, ages, and working conditions. But the walk to work, that cold stretch of time between waking and entering the factory gate, was rarely treated as history because it looked too ordinary to the people living it. They did it every day. They did it half asleep. They did it hungry. They did it with a shawl pulled tight around the shoulders, with boots leaking at the seams, with a child hurrying beside them and the sound of the factory bell somewhere ahead in the dark. And yet, that walk tells us something important about the industrial age, because it was the moment when a person left the household and entered the system. At home, even a poor home, there were still names, relationships, habits, irritations, small comforts, and familiar objects. In the street, moving toward the mill or the mine or the ironworks before dawn, the worker became part of a crowd, a stream of bodies pulled by the same sound toward the same gate under the same pressure of time. Let us begin in a place like Manchester in the 1840s, although the same morning could have taken place in Leeds, Glasgow, Birmingham, Lowell, Pittsburgh, Roubaix, Lille, or any number of industrial towns where smoke and wages remade daily life. It is not quite morning yet. The sky has a greyness to it, but the sun has not risen, and depending on the season it may not rise for hours. In winter, workers often began and ended their working day in darkness. That detail sounds small until you imagine what it means for the body. You wake in the dark, dress in the dark, walk through the dark, work under dim light or gaslight or dirty windows, and return home in the dark. Daylight becomes something you know is happening somewhere else, above the roofline, beyond the factory windows, outside the schedule that has claimed you. The house the worker leaves is usually close to other houses, often too close. Industrial towns grew faster than they could be made livable. In the older countryside, poverty could be severe, but there was at least space around it. In the industrial districts, poverty was packed into brick. Rows of houses were thrown up quickly near factories, canals, rail lines, mills and pits, because workers needed to be close enough to arrive on time. In parts of Britain, back-to-back houses were built with one wall against another house, limiting air and light. Courts and alleys filled with shared privies, overflowing drains, ash pits, standing water, refuse, and the smell of too many people living where streets had not been planned for them. In American mill towns, boarding houses could be more orderly in some places, especially in the early Lowell system, where young women lived under rules meant to reassure families. But even there the day was strict. The work was long, and the bell controlled the morning. In other towns, especially as industry expanded and immigration increased, working-class housing became crowded, noisy, and hard to keep clean no matter how hard families worked at it. The first few steps outside could tell a worker what kind of day it would be. Rain made streets into mud where paving was poor. Frost turned the ground hard and dangerous. Fog mixed with coal smoke and hung low, not the clean fog of open fields, but a heavy industrial fog that caught in the throat. In coal-burning cities, the air could taste bitter before breakfast. Soot settled on window ledges, skin, laundry, and food. A woman might shake out a shawl and know it would be dirty again before the walk was finished. A man might spit black into the gutter and not think much of it, because everyone around him did the same. Children grew up learning the smell of smoke as the smell of morning. There were no cars, no buses in the modern sense, no subway systems for most of the early industrial period, and certainly no comfortable commute for the ordinary worker. People walked. Some walked a few streets. Some walked miles. The closer housing was to the workplace, the higher the rent could be, and poor families often balanced distance against cost. A room near the mill saved time and strength, but could be cramped, unhealthy, and expensive for what it was. A cheaper place farther out might mean leaving earlier, walking longer, and arriving already tired. That is a very old working-class calculation, and it has not entirely disappeared. How far can you afford to live from the place that pays you? How much of your body does the journey take before the work even begins? In some towns, the morning crowd had a sound of its own. Wooden clogs struck stone in northern English mill districts. Boots scraped over brick and mud. Factory girls spoke to one another in low voices, sometimes laughing, sometimes too tired to bother. Men carrying tools walked with the short, practiced pace of people who had made the route so many times that they no longer looked at every turn. Children hurried to keep up, and the smallest among them might be pulled by the hand. In textile towns, young workers could be seen with hair tied back, aprons folded, food wrapped in cloth. In mining districts, men and boys carried lamps or tools, and the walk toward the pit had a different seriousness, because the workplace was not only a building but a descent underground. In iron towns, the furnaces might already be visible before arrival, a glow in the distance, a sign that some work had continued through the night because furnaces and industrial processes did not always obey the human need for sleep. There is a figure from this period who seems almost strange to us now, but was familiar in many industrial towns, the knocker-up. Before cheap alarm clocks became common, some workers paid a person to wake them by tapping on the window with a long pole, knocking at the door, or using some other agreed signal before dawn. This was not a quaint little custom. It existed because being late could be costly. In a world where the factory gate might close, where wages could be docked, where a foreman might mark a worker as unreliable, waking up on time was serious business. A worker who could not afford to be late might pay a small amount to someone whose job was simply to make sure others rose in the dark. Think about that for a moment. An entire job existed because industrial time had become too strict to trust to the body, the rooster, or the first light of day. The bell or whistle ahead was more than a sound. It was a boundary. It reminded everyone in the street that time no longer moved loosely. Before industrial discipline became common, many kinds of labour had their own pressures and demands, but they were not always measured minute by minute. In factories, the hour became a tool of management. A worker's day could begin at 5, 6 or 7, depending on the place, the season, the industry and the law at that moment. In the early decades, especially before major labour reforms, working days of 12 to 14 hours were common in many industries, and children were often included in those schedules. Laws slowly changed this in some countries. Britain's Factory Act of 1833 limited hours for children in textile mills, and required some schooling, though enforcement was uneven at first. Later acts further reduced hours for women and young people. But reform did not arrive all at once, and it did not instantly transform every workplace. For many workers, especially in industries not covered by early laws, the morning still began with the same anxiety. Get there before the bell finishes speaking. The walk was also where the town showed its divisions. The worker might pass warehouses, counting houses, shops, chapels, taverns, pawn shops, and the houses of people who did not have to rise so early. In some cities, factory owners and managers lived away from the smoke if they could afford it, on cleaner streets or in suburbs made possible by the very wealth industry produced. The workers remained close to the smoke because their wages required proximity. Every morning, without anyone making a speech about it, the geography of class could be read by footsteps. Who walked before dawn? Who rode? Who slept longer? Who breathed the smoke and who profited from the chimneys? For women, the walk could carry its own burdens. A young woman working in a mill might leave a boarding house with other girls, which offered safety in numbers but also a constant sense of supervision. In some places, employers and reformers like to describe female factory workers as respectable, orderly, and morally protected, especially when the system depended on convincing families that wage work would not ruin their daughters. But the reality was more complicated. Women workers had to guard their reputations, manage harassment, move through public streets at hours when respectable women were not always expected to be outside, and then endure labour that was often dismissed as lighter simply because women did it. The walk before dawn was not only a commute, it was a daily negotiation with public space. For children, the morning could be confusing in a way that adult records rarely capture. A child does not experience a 12-hour day as an economic arrangement. A child experiences cold feet, hunger, sleepiness, noise, fear of punishment, and the need to keep up. Some children entered textile mills as scavengers, piecers, doffers, or assistants, doing work that adults considered suitable for small bodies and quick fingers. Others worked in mines, match factories, glassworks, potteries, workshops, or on the streets selling goods and services before or after other labour. The youngest industrial workers did not always understand the full system that held them, but they understood the bell. They understood being shaken awake. They understood that falling behind could bring anger. They understood that the morning did not wait because they were tired. Now it is worth being careful here, because not every industrial worker trudged through misery every single morning. Some were proud to have wages. Some preferred factory work to rural dependence or domestic service. Some young women in early American textile towns found wage work a form of independence compared with unpaid labour at home. Some workers used the walk to socialise, court, trade news, share food, sing, tease, argue or plan. Human beings do not stop being human, because conditions are hard. A group of mill girls walking together before dawn could still laugh at a private joke. A miner could still greet a friend. A boy could still kick a stone down the road and make a game of keeping it ahead of him until the gate. These details matter because they keep the past from becoming flat. The industrial age was not one long grey photograph. It was full of colour, speech, irritation, endurance, boredom, humour, hunger, pride, and complaint. But even in those ordinary moments, the smoke was there. Smoke from factories did not only dirty the air, it changed how people understood a successful town. To many Victorians, smoking chimneys meant employment, production, and progress. A town with active chimneys was alive. A mill running at full power meant wages for families and profits for owners. There were people who looked at smoke and saw prosperity. There were also people who looked at the same smoke and saw sickness, ugliness, and shortened lives. Workers often saw both. The chimney that dirtied the street might be the chimney that fed the family. This is one of the uncomfortable truths of industrial history. The thing that harmed people could also be the thing they depended on. As the worker gets closer to the factory district, the traffic thickens. Carts bring coal, cotton, wool, iron, timber, barrels and food. Horses strain against loads. Wheels hit ruts. A canal boat may be moving slowly nearby if the town is built around water transport. Later in the century, railways add another layer of sound and soot, bringing raw materials in and carrying finished goods out. The worker's morning path crosses the path of goods, animals, machines, and money. The industrial age was movement, constant movement, and the worker was one part of it. Cotton grown in the American South, under slavery before the Civil War could be shipped across the Atlantic, processed in Lancashire mills, sold through global markets, and worn by people who never saw a cotton field or a spinning room. Iron rails could move coal, coal could feed engines, engines could power mills, mills could produce cloth, cloth could create fortunes, and the worker walking through the smoke was tied to all of it, whether or not anyone explained it to them. There may be a food seller already awake near the factory gates. Hot drinks, bread, pies, potatoes, or cheap street food could be sold to workers who had left home without enough to eat. In many places, the diet of industrial workers was heavy on bread, potatoes, tea, porridge, cheap cuts, dripping, cheese when available, and whatever could be afforded. A worker who had money might buy something warm before the shift. A worker who did not might rely on what was packed from home. Hunger and work were closely linked. A long day at a machine required energy, but wages did not always provide enough food to supply it. Bad harvests, high bread prices, unemployment, sickness, or wage cuts could turn a normal morning into a harder one very quickly. At the gate, the worker enters a space of rules. Some factories used time books, some used checks or tokens, some had watchmen, some had overseers who knew exactly who was late. In large mills, the stream of workers could be impressive, hundreds moving into the building in a short span of time. The gate concentrated the town's labour into a controlled opening. Outside it, the worker had moved through public streets. Inside it, the employer's authority became more immediate. A worker might be fined for lateness, for damaged materials, for talking, for leaving a station, for breaking rules, for mistakes, for behaviour an overseer judged improper. These fines were a major source of anger in many workplaces because they took from already small wages and often felt arbitrary. To be poor in the industrial age was not only to earn little, it was to have little control over the conditions under which that little was earned. Imagine standing there in the last minute before the shift, with the building in front of you and the morning behind you. You have already walked through smoke, mud, cold, noise, and worry. Your stomach may not be full. Your hands may already ache from yesterday. If you are a child, you may still want to sleep. If you are a mother, part of your mind may still be at home with an infant left in someone else's care, or with older children who must manage without you until the day ends. If you are a father, you may be calculating rent, coal, bread, and whether the wages this week will be enough. If you are young and newly employed, you may feel a little proud, because wages are wages, and work can bring a sense of place. If you are older, you may already know what the day will take from you. The factory doors do not care about any of that. They open, they close, and the day begins. Once inside the yard or entrance hall, the outside world drops away quickly. Coats may be hung, tools collected, lamps checked, or machines inspected. The sound of the street is replaced by the sound of production. In textile mills, the difference could be startling. One moment, the muffled noises of morning. The next, the rising mechanical assault of spinning frames, looms, belts, pulleys, and steam power. In ironworks, the heat announces itself. In mines, the morning path continues downward, away from the sky entirely. In match factories, potteries, chemical works, and other trades, the worker might enter air already carrying substances that would settle into the body over years. White phosphorus in matchmaking caused terrible jaw disease among workers. Pottery workers inhaled dust and lead. Textile workers breathed cotton fibres. Miners inhaled coal dust and faced gas, collapse, flooding, and explosions. The walk through smoke was only the first exposure of the day. And still, that morning walk had one quality the factory did not. It had motion chosen by the worker's own legs. Not freedom exactly, because the destination was required, but a last measure of bodily rhythm before the machine rhythm took over. A person could slow slightly, glance at a window, speak to a friend, avoid a puddle, shift a bundle from one hand to another, breathe the outside air even if that air was dirty. Inside, movement narrowed. The task determined where the body stood and what it repeated. The morning walk was a corridor between two kinds of poverty: the poverty of the crowded home and the poverty of the disciplined workplace. But it was also the place where workers saw one another, where they became aware that their private struggle was shared. This shared morning movement helped form working-class consciousness in ways that are easy to miss. People who walk to the same mill at the same hour, who stand at the same gate, who hear the same bell, who suffer the same fines, who compare wages and injuries and overseers, begin to understand themselves not only as individuals trying to survive, but as a group. That did not happen instantly, and it did not happen everywhere in the same way, but the industrial age brought workers together physically in unprecedented numbers. The very system that disciplined them also made them visible to one another. The walk to work, the factory yard, the dinner break, the wage line, the crowded street after the shift. These were places where complaints became conversations, conversations became demands, and demands eventually became unions, strikes, reforms, and political movements. The worker hurrying before dawn may not be thinking about history, but history is often made by people who are simply trying to get through Tuesday. In some towns, Sunday was the only real break from this pattern, and even Sunday could be filled with church, washing, cooking, repairing clothes, visiting family, and preparing for the next week. The Monday morning walk carried a particular weight. So did the walk after payday, when debts were paid, food was bought, and taverns filled. So did the walk in winter, when illness moved through crowded housing, and still people had to go, because missing a day meant losing pay. There were no paid sick days for most workers, no health insurance, no reliable compensation if the machine took a finger or the mine took a life. Friendly societies, mutual aid groups, churches, unions and neighbours sometimes helped, but the safety net was thin and uneven. A cough could become a crisis. A broken leg could become hunger. A dead wage earner could push a family into the workhouse, charity, or desperate labour. That knowledge travelled with people in the morning. It was there in the way they hurried, in the way they guarded a job even when they hated it, in the way parents sent children because the arithmetic of survival left no clean choices. The industrial age is often told as a story of inventions: the steam engine, the power loom, the spinning jenny, the Bessemer process, the railway, the telegraph. Those inventions matter. They changed the world. But every invention that entered daily use also changed someone's morning. Someone had to wake earlier, walk farther, feed the machine, maintain it, clean around it, breathe what it released, and keep pace with what it made possible. The sun is beginning to lift now, though in a smoke-heavy town it may appear as a pale disk rather than a bright arrival. The worker is no longer outside to see much of it. The shift has begun. The street that was full of footsteps a short time ago has thinned. Doors close, chimneys continue. A few latecomers run, and running in working clothes on poor streets before a 12-hour day is its own kind of misery. A watchman may shake his head. An overseer may make a mark. A child may arrive frightened because being late is not a small mistake when adults are angry and wages are at stake. Inside, the first tasks of the day are already underway. Machines do not warm gently into human need. They start and people adjust. The worker who walked through smoke must now stand in it, breathe through it, labour beside it, and accept that the day has only just begun. The sound rises around them until the memory of the street becomes faint, and the body begins the long negotiation with hours. Hands find their places, eyes search for errors, shoulders settle into strain. The morning that began in a crowded room has crossed the dark streets and entered the factory floor, where time is no longer measured by distance to the gate, but by the slow movement from bell to bell, from the first shock of noise to the next brief pause, from the first breath of dust to the meal carried in a tin or cloth, waiting somewhere out of reach until the rules allow the worker to stop. The first thing the worker meets inside the mill is not the overseer, not the machine, not even the heat. It is the sound. The sound arrives all at once so completely that it changes the room before the eyes have time to understand what they are seeing. Oh, cotton mill in the industrial age was not loud in the way a busy street is loud, with separate noises that can be picked apart and followed. It was loud in layers, belts running overhead, shafts turning, looms striking, frames rattling, bobbins spinning, carts moving over floorboards, steam engines thudding somewhere below or in an adjoining engine house, 100 small impacts repeating so quickly that they became one continuous assault. The body did not merely hear it. The body stood inside it. A new worker entering that room for the first time might instinctively flinch. The older workers usually did not. They had already learned the first lesson of the mill, which was that surprise was useless. The noise was not a temporary condition. It was not something that would settle once the day got going. It was the day getting going. It filled the hours from the first start of machinery until the final stopping. And because so much of the work required attention, the worker had to learn to think through it. Orders were shouted close to the ear. Signals were made with hands, nods, looks, and habit. A woman working at a loom might recognise a broken thread by the smallest change in movement or sound, even while the rest of the room thundered around her. A spinner might hear that something was wrong with a machine long before a visitor would notice anything at all. This was one of the strange skills industrial workers developed. They became fluent in noise. To a person raised in quieter work, the mill could feel almost impossible. In earlier household spinning, a woman with a wheel heard the rhythm of her own tool, the small repeated sound of fibre becoming thread. In hand-loom weaving there was labour and skill and strain, but the pace belonged more directly to the weaver's body. The power loom changed that relationship. The machine did not wait for the worker's natural rhythm. It imposed one. By the middle of the 19th century, in textile districts across Britain and in growing industrial towns in the United States and Europe, thousands of workers spent their days in rooms where mechanical rhythm replaced the older pacing of hand labour. The room told the body what speed meant. The worker adapted or failed. Imagine standing at one of those looms in a cotton mill. The machine is not a single object in the way a hammer or a spinning wheel is a single object. It is a system of moving parts, connected to power that may come from water, steam, or line shafts running through the building. The shuttle flies back and forth. The warp threads lift and lower. The cloth builds slowly in front of you, inch by inch, but nothing about the process feels slow. The strikes are quick, hard, and repetitive. Your job is to keep watch. Watch for broken threads. Watch for flaws. Watch for tangles. Watch for anything that might waste material or stop production. If something breaks, you must act quickly, because the machine's time is not your time. A stoppage is not simply an inconvenience. It is lost output, and lost output attracts attention. In many mills, one worker tended more than one machine. This was one of the ways industrial productivity increased. The machine did more of the direct motion, while the worker monitored, corrected, replaced, tied, carried, and kept the process moving. To someone looking from a distance, that could appear easier than older labour. After all, the machine was doing much of the visible work. But anyone who spent a day there understood the trick. The work had not disappeared. It had changed shape. Instead of one whole craft controlled by one worker, the job became a long period of alert repetition. A worker might walk back and forth between frames, watching rows of spindles, tying broken ends, removing full bobbins, replacing empty ones, cleaning lint, and keeping pace with several moving points of failure at once. It demanded attention without variety, speed without freedom, and endurance without the satisfaction of finishing something whole. The heat came next. Textile mills often needed warmth and humidity because cotton behaved better in damp air. Dry thread snapped more easily. Humid air kept fibres more manageable, and that meant the room was maintained in a way that served the material first and the workers second. In summer, the heat could become oppressive. In winter, The air might still be close and damp inside, especially compared with the cold street outside. Windows existed, and many mills had rows of them, but windows were not the same as clean air. They were often kept closed for reasons of temperature, humidity, dust control, or simple managerial habit. Ventilation, when present, was frequently inadequate. The worker breathed what the room gave. Cotton dust was one of the hidden realities of mill work. It floated in the air, settled on clothing, clung to hair, entered the nose and mouth, and worked slowly on the lungs. Workers in cotton mills often developed respiratory problems from breathing fibres day after day. The condition later known as bisonosis, sometimes called brown lung, was tied to exposure to cotton dust, though the workers themselves did not need a formal medical term to know that the air hurt them. They knew coughing, they knew tightness in the chest, they knew the difference between breathing outside and breathing near the machinery. In some mills the air was visibly full of lint, especially in rooms where cotton was opened, carded, or processed before spinning. A beam of light through a dirty window could reveal thousands of particles moving through the room, and every breath drew some part of that industry into the body. The dust also made the place feel alive in an unpleasant way. It gathered under machines in corners, along beams, near belts, and on workers' clothes. A worker could leave the mill coated in the material they had handled all day. In woolen mills, wool fibres and oil created their own atmosphere. In flax mills, dust could be particularly harsh. In factories using dyes, chemicals, metals, or other materials, the air carried different dangers. But the textile mill had a special combination of heat, humidity, lint, noise, and motion that made it one of the defining workplaces of the industrial age. It was a place where the body's most basic acts, hearing and breathing, became part of the labour. Now consider the clock. Not the clock as a small object on a wall, though there often was one, and not the clock as something decorative or useful in the ordinary way. The factory clock was a form of authority. Its face might be placed where workers could see it, or where the overseer could. Its purpose was not simply to tell the hour, it organised obedience. In pre-industrial work, time mattered, of course. Seasons mattered. Market days mattered. Church bells mattered. Dawn and dusk mattered. But factory time divided the day with a new strictness. Start time, meal time, return time, stop time. The clock did not care whether the worker had slept poorly, whether a child was sick at home, whether the street was icy, whether the body was failing in the afternoon. The clock made the day measurable, and what could be measured could be controlled. Workers sometimes distrusted factory clocks, and not without reason. There were complaints in some places that clocks were set unfairly, slow at stopping time or fast at starting time, always to the advantage of the employer. Whether every complaint was accurate is less important than what the suspicion reveals. Workers understood that time itself had become part of the wage bargain. A few minutes taken here and there could add up. If the day was already 12 or 13 hours, the difference between a fair clock and an unfair clock mattered. Time was no longer only passing. Time was being purchased. The overseer moved through this world as the human face of that discipline. He might be called a foreman, overlooker, boss, or manager, depending on the place and industry, but his role was similar. He watched production, enforced rules, corrected workers, reported problems, and represented the employer's authority on the floor. Some overseers were experienced workers themselves and knew the machines well. Some were harsh, because harshness was rewarded. Some were petty. Some were fair by the standards of the time. Some were feared. A worker's day could be shaped by the temperament of one man moving between machines, noticing who was slow, who talked, who made mistakes, who challenged him, who was vulnerable. In many mills, discipline was constant but not always dramatic. It did not need to be. It lived in small corrections, fines, warnings, shouted orders, public scolding, and the knowledge that work could be lost. A rule posted on a wall might list penalties for lateness, absence, talking, damaged materials, leaving a station, or failing to clean properly. A broken thread was one thing. A broken rule was another. The worker learned not only how to operate in the room, but how to behave under observation, when to lower the eyes, when to hurry, when to speak, when not to answer back, when to pretend not to hear an insult. These are not skills that appear in technical manuals, but they were part of the job. Children inside the mill experienced the same room differently because of their size. Some of the work given to them depended on being small. In textile mills, children might crawl or move around machinery to clean, gather waste, or fix problems in places adults could not easily reach. Earlier in the industrial age, before reforms reduced the use of very young children in some factories, this could be especially dangerous. A child working as a scavenger might have to clear loose cotton from beneath machines while they were still moving. A piecer might mend broken threads quickly, close to active parts. The child's body, which should have been protected by its smallness, was useful to the factory because it could fit where danger was concentrated. This is one of those facts that still stops the mind for a moment. The machine did not become safer because a child was near it. The room did not become quieter. The hours did not become shorter simply because the worker had not yet grown. Reformers who visited factories in the 19th century often wrote with horror about children pale from long hours indoors, stunted by labour, injured by machinery, or too tired for schooling. Factory owners and defenders sometimes argued that children were better off employed than idle, that wages helped families, that the work was not as harsh as critics claimed, or that reform would damage industry. The debate was real, but the child still had to stand in the room while adults argued elsewhere. Women formed a large part of the textile workforce in many regions, and their work was often described in language meant to make it sound natural or light. Nimble fingers, suitable labour, domestic skill transferred to factory conditions, but a woman tending machines in a mill was not sitting quietly with a basket of sewing. She was working long hours in heat, noise and dust, often for wages lower than men's, under the authority of male managers or overseers, while still carrying expectations about modesty, obedience, family duty and domestic responsibility. If she was unmarried, her wages might be partly her own and partly claimed by family need. If she was married, her paid work could be necessary for survival but still treated as secondary to the husband's role. If she had children, childcare became a problem solved by relatives, older siblings, neighbours, luck, or necessity. The mill did not pause to ask how the household was arranged. It required bodies at machines. That is one of the blunt truths of industrial capitalism in this period. The factory's appetite was not moral or immoral in the way a person is. It was structural. It needed labour at certain hours, in certain numbers, at certain costs to produce certain goods. Families then rearranged themselves around that demand. Meals shifted, sleep shifted, childhood shifted, marriage shifted. The old household economy, where production and family life were often intertwined under one roof or within a local community, gave way in many places to a wage economy, where the worker left home and sold time somewhere else. The mill took the worker's hours and returned wages, but the hours it took were not empty. They were the hours in which children grew, meals were prepared, bodies rested, stories were told, friendships were kept, and daylight passed. Inside the room, the machine clock divided those hours into something strangely both slow and fast. A minute near a dangerous machine could pass with sharp intensity. An hour of repetitive labour could blur. The morning might feel endless until suddenly the meal break arrived, and then that break might vanish so quickly that it hardly seemed real. Workers became experts in internal timekeeping. They knew the feel of the first hour, when the body was still waking. They knew the late morning drag. They knew the moment before the break when hunger became difficult to ignore. They knew the afternoon heaviness, when attention could slip and danger increased. They knew the last stretch, when the bell seemed both near and impossibly far. The bell or whistle that marked breaks did not create rest in the generous sense. It allowed a pause. That distinction matters. A meal break in a factory day was not leisure. It was recovery under limits. A worker might eat in a designated room, outside in the yard, near the workplace, or in some mills even remain close to the machines. Food had to be simple, portable and affordable. Bread, cheese, potatoes, oatcakes, cold meat if available, pies, tea or whatever had been packed at home. The body needed calories, but the break might be too short for the food to feel like a meal. Workers ate with dusty hands in noisy surroundings, with the knowledge that the clock was already counting the return. The machine had stopped only because the schedule permitted it. It would start again. Before that break, though, the first half of the day continued with its small emergencies. A thread snapped, a belt slipped, a loom jammed, a bobbin filled and needed replacing, a shuttle flew wrong. A worker reached too quickly, a child moved too close. Most of the day's dangers were not spectacular. They were ordinary and repeated. The factory accident was often not the result of one extraordinary event, but of familiarity combined with fatigue. A worker who had stood near a machine for months might become used to its movement, and that very familiarity could become dangerous. The machine was always the machine. The worker was the one who became tired. Loose clothing was a constant hazard. Hair, sleeves, aprons, scarves, and fingers could be caught by moving parts. Injuries could be severe. Crushed hands, severed fingers, broken arms, scalping, burns, eye injuries, and worse. In some industries, death was an accepted possibility in a way that is hard to comprehend now. Not accepted peacefully, not without grief, but accepted as part of the cost of work by people who had little power to demand otherwise. A worker injured in a factory might lose wages immediately. If the injury meant permanent disability, the consequences could reach the whole family. There was no modern workers' compensation system for much of the period. Charity, poor relief, friendly societies, union funds where they existed, family support or begging might be all that remained. Visitors to mills sometimes noticed the order before they noticed the danger. Rows of machines, synchronized movement, hundreds of workers performing specialized tasks, raw material entering and finished goods leaving. To the industrial mind, this order was impressive. It represented efficiency, improvement, modernity. A mill could be described almost like a living organism, with power moving through shafts and belts like blood through veins. But from the worker's position, that order could feel like confinement. The building was rational because each part had been arranged for output. The worker's body had to become part of that arrangement. There is a particular kind of exhaustion produced by work that requires both alertness and repetition. Heavy outdoor labour exhausts the muscles openly. You feel the weight, the lifting, the weather, the ground. Mill work could exhaust in a different way. It demanded that the mind remain sharp, while the task itself repeated beyond interest. It kept the worker close to danger without always providing the stimulation that helps a person stay awake. It created fatigue in the ears, the lungs, the eyes, the nerves, and the patience. By midday, a worker might be less visibly tired than a field hand after harvest, but the body was being worn all the same. The mill also changed speech. In a room where machinery was too loud for normal conversation, people developed other ways to communicate. Lip reading, gestures, touches on the arm, quick glances and repeated routines carried meaning. Workers who spent years together could understand one another with little spoken language during the shift. Outside the mill, speech returned in bursts. At breaks or after work, complaints, jokes, songs and gossip could spill out with force as if held back by the machines. Some workplaces had singing traditions, but in many mechanized rooms the noise made song impossible. Where older labour might allow storytelling, singing or conversation alongside work, the mill often reduced the social life of labour during working hours, then concentrated it in the edges of the day. The windows deserve attention because they shaped how the room felt. Large mill windows were built to bring in light, especially before electric lighting. On paper, that sounds generous. In practice, the glass could become dirty with soot from outside and dust from inside. The view might be another brick wall, a yard, a canal, a chimney, or a narrow strip of sky. Workers near the windows may have felt the difference between natural light and the dimmer areas deeper inside, but they did not have the freedom to move toward comfort. The station determined the body's place. In winter, daylight might arrive late and leave early, and the working day could stretch across both darknesses. Gaslighting extended usable hours, but again, improvement for production was not always improvement for workers. A brighter room could mean a longer day. The machine clock did not only count hours, it changed morals. Punctuality, regularity, and obedience became industrial virtues. To be a good worker was increasingly to be on time, steady, sober, reliable, and willing to submit to the schedule. Employers, reformers, religious leaders, and political economists often praise these qualities. Some workers embraced them too, because regular wages and respectability mattered. But there was tension beneath it. The same discipline that could support pride could also crush autonomy. A worker might value steadiness and still hate being treated as replaceable. A mother might value wages and still resent leaving a child. A skilled spinner might take pride in output and still resist wage cuts. Industrial culture was not simply imposed from above. It was argued over every day in the conduct of work. Some mills had rules about cleanliness, prayer, behaviour, or moral conduct, especially in more paternalistic systems. Early Lowell mills in Massachusetts, for example, became famous for employing young women under boarding house supervision, with rules designed to present factory labour as disciplined and respectable. These workers also wrote, read, attended lectures, published writing, and later protested wage cuts and worsening conditions. That mixture is important. The same system could offer opportunity and exploitation at once. A young woman might come to the mill for wages, independence, and education, then find herself fighting the speed up of machines, the length of hours, or the reduction of pay. Industrial life often began with promise and then narrowed under pressure. In Britain, the textile mill had already become a symbol by then of both progress and suffering. Parliamentary investigations collected testimony from workers, doctors, overseers, and owners. Some testimony described children working long hours, workers beaten or fined, deformities from standing, injuries from machines, and exhaustion so severe that children struggled to stay awake. Critics used these accounts to push for factory legislation. Defenders questioned the worst stories, warned against government interference, or insisted that factory work was better than the alternatives. These arguments unfolded in printed reports and political debates, while inside the mills the day continued bell by bell. The worker at the machine may have known little of those debates except what reached the shop floor through newspapers, chapels, unions, radical speakers, or local rumour. But they knew the facts of the room. They knew how long they stood. They knew what the air felt like. They knew who had been injured. They knew whether the overseer was fair. They knew whether the clock seemed honest. They knew whether wages stretched to the end of the week. That kind of knowledge was not abstract. It was carried in the body and discussed at the meal break, in the street, at home, in taverns, chapels, meeting halls, and union rooms. The middle hours of the day are where the mill did its deepest work on a person. Morning still had some leftover momentum from waking and arriving. Late afternoon had the pull of the ending, even if the end was far away. But the middle could feel suspended, a long interior stretch where the worker was fully absorbed into the factory's rhythm. This was when the noise became normal enough to stop being noticed and still damaging enough to matter. This was when dust became part of breathing. This was when heat settled into the clothes. This was when small mistakes became more likely. The body adapted, but adaptation is not the same as comfort. It is simply the body finding a way to continue. There were moments of skill hidden in that continuation, A good worker could move economically, wasting little motion. An experienced worker could correct a problem before it became costly. An older child could teach a younger one where to stand, when to duck, what not to touch. A group of workers could keep a room running through cooperation that managers might not fully see. Industrial labour was often organised to make workers seem interchangeable, but in practice, experience mattered. The loss of a skilled worker could slow production. The confidence of a room often depended on people whose names never appeared in histories of invention. And still, the mill belonged to the machine clock. That is what must be understood before anything else about the industrial workday makes sense. The worker did not finish when tired. The worker finished when released. The worker didn't pause when the body asked for pause. The worker paused when the schedule permitted it. The worker did not decide that the air was too thick, the sound too much, the heat too heavy, the hand too sore, unless the situation became impossible or dangerous beyond toleration. The clock, the bell, the wage, and the overseer worked together to define endurance. Outside, the town continued through the day. Food was bought, children cried, carts moved, laundry hung and darkened with soot. Shopkeepers counted coins and smoke kept rising. Inside, the machines made their own weather. Heat near the bodies, damp in the air, dust in the lungs, sound against the ears, time on the wall. A worker could glance at the clock and feel both hope and defeat, because the hands moved. Yes, but not quickly enough. The day was measurable, which meant the end was real. But the measuring also made every remaining hour visible. By early afternoon, after whatever short meal had been allowed, the return to the room could feel harder than the beginning. The body, briefly released, had to submit again. This second start was its own small cruelty. The worker had stopped just long enough to feel the weight of stopping, then was required to re-enter the noise. The machines resumed, or perhaps they had never fully stopped. The room filled again. The hands returned to their tasks, the dust rose, the clock continued, and now the work began to move from ordinary strain into something deeper, because it is one thing to stand for an hour in heat and noise, another thing to do it for 6, and another still to understand that the day has several hours left and tomorrow will ask for the same body again. By the time the worker had returned from the short meal break, the body already knew the truth that the clock refused to acknowledge. The day was not half finished in any meaningful human sense. The easier part, if there had been one, was gone. Morning had used up the first store of strength. The walk from home, the first rush of machinery, the heat of the room, the careful watching, the bending and reaching and standing, all of it had already taken something from the legs, the back, the shoulders, the eyes. Then came a few minutes with food. Not enough time to rest deeply, not enough quiet to recover fully, only enough to remind the worker what stillness felt like before the bell or whistle pulled everyone back. That second beginning was sometimes harder than the first. A person can force the body into motion when the day is new. It is more difficult to do it after the body has briefly stopped and begun to understand how tired it is. 12 hours on your feet sounds like a number until you place it inside a human body. It means weight sinking into the ankles hour after hour. It means knees that stiffen when they are held in the same posture too long and then complain when they are asked to move quickly. It means the small muscles of the lower back trying to hold a person upright while the hands continue doing work that cannot wait. It means the soles of the feet burning inside boots or shoes that may not fit well, may not be dry, and may already have been worn by someone else before they became yours. It means the neck bent toward a machine, the eyes trained on thread, metal, flame, coal, cloth, needle, shuttle, lever, cart, or gauge, until ordinary looking becomes a kind of labour. It means that by late afternoon, a worker might not feel pain in one dramatic place, but everywhere in a dull, spread-out way that had no clear beginning and no clear end. Industrial labour did not invent bodily exhaustion. People had always worked until they hurt. Agricultural labourers, servants, sailors, builders, washerwomen, miners before the factory age, and countless others knew fatigue deeply. What changed in the industrial age was the regular organisation of that fatigue. The clock gathered it into shifts. The factory, mine, workshop, and mill demanded it at fixed hours. A harvest might be brutal but seasonal. A household emergency might exhaust everyone, but then it passed. Industrial work made long duration ordinary. The same strain returned day after day, week after week, often from childhood into adulthood, until the body shaped itself around the work. Shoulders rounded, hands thickened, lungs weakened, hearing faded. The gait changed, the posture changed, even sleep changed, because a person who had stood too long sometimes lay down and still felt the machine in the muscles. In a textile mill, standing was not passive. A worker tending looms or frames might be constantly shifting position, stepping sideways, leaning forward, reaching up, tying broken threads, lifting bobbins, clearing waste, watching several points at once. The movement was not large enough to feel like healthy exercise and not varied enough to spare the joints. It was repetitive, exacting, and timed by the needs of the machinery. In the early part of the day, the worker could still correct posture, stretch a hand quickly, take a fuller breath when the overseer was not watching. Later, those small adjustments became less satisfying. The body started to conserve itself. Movements became shorter. Feet dragged slightly. The mind narrowed to the next necessary action. Tie this thread. Lift this load. Watch this belt. Step back. Do not put your hand there. Do not let the cloth spoil. Do not slow down. For miners, the body's struggle was different, and in some ways even more severe. A miner's workday did not only mean standing, it meant crouching, crawling, lifting, striking, shoveling, hauling, breathing dust in narrow spaces, and trusting the ground overhead not to give way. In some coal mines, men worked in seams so low that they could not stand upright for long stretches. Boys opened and closed ventilation doors in darkness, spending hours alone underground. Hurriers, often children and young women in earlier decades in Britain, dragged coal carts through low passages using chains and harnesses before reforms changed the practice. The body underground was folded into the mine. Knees, hips, spine and lungs were forced into the shape of the work. When the miner finally emerged, the return to open air did not erase what the day had done. Coal dust remained in the skin, under the nails, in the throat, and over years, deep in the lungs. Iron and steel work gave the body another enemy: heat. Near furnaces, rolling mills, puddling furnaces and foundries, men laboured in temperatures that could overwhelm even a strong worker. The heat was not like standing outside on a hot day. It came from fire contained for industrial purposes, concentrated and directed, radiating from metal, brick, flame, and molten material. Workers sweated through clothing, drank constantly when water was available, and learned to judge danger by colour and timing. A puddler stirring molten iron in a furnace worked with strength, skill and endurance, but the work consumed men quickly. Some trades were known to age workers early. Visitors sometimes remarked on the physical power of iron workers, but power did not mean the body was safe. Burns, eye damage, dehydration, exhaustion, crushed limbs, and sudden fatal accidents were part of that world. A man could be admired for surviving work that was slowly destroying him. For women in factories and workshops, the strain was often described by outsiders as less severe, because it did not always look like the heavy labour associated with male strength. That description misses the point. A woman in a textile mill standing all day in heat and dust, a match worker handling dangerous chemicals, a seamstress sewing by the piece into the night, a laundry worker lifting wet cloth and breathing steam, a domestic servant climbing stairs from morning until late evening, all knew physical exhaustion that was both real and underestimated. Repetitive handwork could deform fingers and damage eyesight. Long standing could cause swelling and chronic pain. Poor nutrition made fatigue worse. Pregnancy did not always remove a woman from work because wages and household needs could make rest impossible. A working woman's body was expected to serve the employer and the household, often in the same day, with little recognition that both forms of labour drew from the same limited strength. The hands tell much of this story. Industrial workers' hands were not merely dirty, they were trained, damaged and marked. Textile workers had fingers quick enough to piece broken thread while machines moved. Metal workers had hands hardened by tools and heat. Miners had cuts that filled with coal dust. Seamstresses had needle pricks, cramped fingers, and eyes strained from close work in poor light. Children in mills could have small hands that employers considered useful, but those hands were placed near machinery that could crush or tear them. A missing finger in an industrial town was not a rare sight. It was a record of employment written on the body. Some injuries healed badly, some became infected, some prevented future work. A hand that could no longer grip was not only a medical problem, it was an economic disaster. Feet mattered just as much, though history notices them less. A worker who stood all day needed footwear that could survive the floor, but good shoes cost money. Many working people wore boots or shoes that were patched, stiff, damp or poorly shaped. Children might wear hand-me-downs. In mills, floors could be slick with oil, dust or moisture. In mines, footing could be uneven and wet. In foundries and metal shops, sparks and hot fragments added danger. A blister might sound minor, but a blister on a foot that must stand 12 hours and then walk home can become an everyday misery. There were workers who began the morning with sore feet from the previous day and no practical way to let them heal. Rest was the cure, and rest was exactly what wages did not allow. The back carried everything. It carried loads, posture, bending, standing, and the quiet discipline of not collapsing. In warehouses, docks, rail yards, and factories, workers lifted and moved goods by hand in quantities that seem almost unbelievable from a modern distance. Even when machines assisted production, the human body remained essential for feeding, carrying, sorting, stacking, pushing, and cleaning. A sack, a crate, a bundle of cloth, a bar of metal, a load of coal, a basket of bobbins, each had to be moved by someone. Repeated lifting without modern safety practices produced strains, hernias, chronic pain, and permanent weakness. Many workers simply lived with those injuries because pain that did not immediately stop work was not treated as a reason to stop working. The eyes had their own fatigue. In textile mills, workers watched threads and cloth for floors while dust moved through the air. In workshops, people performed close tasks under natural light, gaslight, candlelight, or smoky lamps. Seamstresses and tailors bent over fabric until the edge of the needle blurred. Watchmakers, printers, engravers, and other skilled workers damaged their sight through close attention. In factories with moving machinery, a moment of visual confusion could become dangerous. Poor lighting made this worse, but so did harsh light. The industrial age was not kind to the senses. It demanded that eyes, ears, skin, lungs, and muscles all perform beyond comfort for long hours, then blamed workers when fatigue produced mistakes. Hearing loss was another cost that often went unmeasured. The constant noise of textile mills, metal shops, machine rooms, and factories could damage hearing gradually. Workers did not always describe it as injury because it happened slowly, and because many people around them experienced the same thing. A person who had spent years in a loud mill might raise their voice without noticing, miss softer sounds, or feel the world outside as strangely muffled. The ear, like the lungs, kept a record of the workplace even when the worker left the building. The lungs may have paid the highest invisible price. Coal dust, cotton dust, silica dust, metal fumes, chemical vapours, smoke, soot, steam, and poor ventilation moved through industrial bodies every day. A cough could become normal. Shortness of breath could be treated as part of aging, even when it came early. In cotton districts, workers knew that certain rooms were worse than others. In mines, blackened spit and chronic lung disease were familiar. In potteries, dust and lead exposure harmed workers. In match factories, phosphorus poisoning could cause terrible disease. In cities, the home offered little escape because the air outside the workplace was often polluted too. A worker might breathe smoke at home, smoke on the walk, dust at work, and smoke again on the way back. The body had no clean interval in which to recover. Fatigue also changed behaviour. A tired worker is more irritable, less patient, less able to notice danger, and more likely to make mistakes. Employers sometimes saw this as a moral failing. Reformers sometimes saw it as evidence of overwork. Workers themselves knew the feeling without needing a theory. Late in the day, a small correction from an overseer might feel unbearable. A machine problem that would have been manageable in the morning could become infuriating. A child might cry from exhaustion and be punished for disobedience. A man might come home silent because speech required energy he no longer had. A woman might still have to cook, clean, nurse, mend, or comfort others after her paid work ended, and fatigue could turn ordinary household tasks into tests of endurance. This is where the phrase 12 hours becomes misleading, because the paid shift was not the whole day. If the shift lasted 12 hours, the worker still had to wake before it, dress, eat, walk there, walk back, wash if water and time allowed, care for family, prepare food, repair clothing and sleep. A 12-hour shift could easily create a 14 or 15-hour work-centred day. For women with domestic responsibilities, the total labour could stretch even longer. For children, the hours took time away from schooling, play, growth and rest. Industrial reformers argued over legal limits because they understood, or at least began to understand, that the human body could not be treated as an endlessly renewable part of a machine. But reform came slowly because every reduced hour raised questions of profit, wages, competition, and control. The working body was also a hungry body. Long labour required calories, and poor wages often did not provide enough. Bread, potatoes, porridge, tea, dripping cheap meat when possible, cheese, onions, and simple pies formed much of the diet in many working-class communities. Some workers ate enough to keep going, but not enough to thrive. Children doing adult-length days needed food for growth and labour at the same time. If food prices rose, fatigue deepened. Hunger makes cold worse, pain sharper, patience thinner, and concentration harder. A worker who fainted, slowed, or made mistakes might be judged weak, lazy, or troublesome when the real problem was that the body had not been properly fed for the work demanded of it. There were efforts to resist this physical exhaustion, though not always in open political ways. Workers learned tricks for saving motion. They shared advice about posture, tools, pacing, and how to avoid the worst anger of supervisors. They used humour to survive discomfort. They leaned when they could, sat when allowed, swapped tasks if possible, covered for one another, and watched for signs that someone was about to collapse. In some workplaces, informal cooperation kept people alive. In others, competition and fear made such cooperation harder. The social life of the workplace was shaped by the body's needs as much as by wages. A worker who helped another clear a jam, lift a load, or hide a moment's rest might be offering more than kindness. They were recognising a shared condition. Doctors, inspectors, and reformers gradually began to describe industrial fatigue in more formal language. Reports on factories and mines gathered testimony about deformities, injuries, respiratory disease, and the effects of long hours on children. Some physicians noted that certain forms of labour harmed growth, posture, or health. Employers often disputed the severity or blamed workers' habits, housing, drinking, or poverty, rather than the work itself. There was truth in the fact that housing, diet, sanitation and alcohol mattered, but that truth could be used to avoid another one. Work itself was damaging bodies. The workplace and the home were not separate problems. Low wages produced poor housing and poor food. Poor housing and poor food made workers more vulnerable to industrial strain. Industrial strain reduced health and earning power. The circle closed tightly around the poor. A worker's body was not only a private possession, it was a family asset. If a father's back failed, the household income might fall. If a mother became ill, both wages and domestic care could vanish. If a child was injured, the family lost income and gained a dependent. This is part of why people endured so much. Leaving a job was not a simple act of self-protection when others depended on the wage. A worker might know that the mill heir worsened a cough and still return because rent was due. A miner might fear the pit and still descend because children needed food. A seamstress might continue sewing with failing eyesight because each completed piece meant payment. The body was spent because the family could not afford to save it, and yet there was pride in bodies that could work. That pride deserves space beside the suffering. Industrial workers often valued toughness, skill, steadiness, and the ability to endure a hard day. A miner who could do his work well, an iron worker who could stand the heat, a spinner who could manage difficult machinery, a weaver who kept several looms running, a seamstress known for speed and neatness, all could possess real dignity in their labour. The tragedy is not that they worked hard. Hard work can be meaningful. The tragedy is how often that strength was taken for granted, underpaid, used up, and replaced when it broke. By late afternoon, the body entered a different state. This was not the sharp tiredness of the morning or the heavy reluctance after the meal break. It was a deeper depletion. Attention had to be forced. The worker might begin counting smaller units of time, not hours but tasks, not tasks but moments. Finish this row, replace these bobbins, get through this cart, hold steady until the next bell. The room that had been overwhelming in the morning might now feel strangely distant, as if the mind had wrapped itself in a layer of dullness to survive the sound. That dullness could be dangerous. A person who no longer fully felt the room might move too slowly, reach too late, step too close. Fatigue and machinery were a bad combination, and the final hours of a long shift could be when the day became most treacherous. For children, this late-day exhaustion could be especially severe. Accounts from reform investigations describe children struggling to stay awake at work, being punished for drowsiness, or becoming careless from fatigue. Some employers claim such stories were exaggerated. Some were, many were not. Any parent or anyone who has watched a tired child near the end of a long day can understand the danger without needing a report. Children are not built for 12 hours of industrial discipline. Their bodies seek movement, rest, food, sleep, and play in rhythms that machines do not respect. The industrial age often demanded from them the attention of adults and paid them less than adults for giving it. The final bell, when it came, did not restore the body. It only released it. That distinction is important. A worker did not become rested because the shift ended. The worker became free to carry exhaustion elsewhere. The legs that had stood all day now had to walk home. The lungs that had breathed dust now returned to smoke-filled streets. The hands that had tied, lifted, cut, or carried now might need to hold a child, prepare food, wash, mend, or count wages. At the moment of release, some workers felt relief. Some felt numbness. Some felt hunger more sharply than anything else. The machine stopped, or the worker left it to another shift, but the body continued carrying the day. Look closely at that person leaving the mill or mine or works. The posture tells you something. Shoulders lower than in the morning, steps slower. Clothing marked by dust, oil, lint, soot, sweat, or heat. Hair damp or coated. Face older than it looked before sunrise. Around them, others emerge in the same condition, forming the evening version of the morning crowd. They may talk now because the machines no longer drown them out. They may complain about the overseer, laugh at something that happened, compare injuries, discuss wages, mention a sick child, plan to stop for food, or walk in silence because the day has used up the words. The street receives them, but it does not soften them. It is tempting to imagine that the body under industrial labour was only a victim of the workplace, but it was also the place where history was stored. Every law limiting hours, every strike over conditions, every union demand, every factory inspection, every argument about child labour or women's labour or dangerous trades came from bodies that could not endlessly absorb what the system demanded. Reform did not begin as an idea in a clean room. It began in coughing, limping, burns, hunger, deformity, exhaustion, funerals, and workers saying in one way or another that the day was too long and the cost too high. The 12-hour body became political because it had to. The worker walking out after such a day might not have used that language. They might simply have wanted supper. They might have wanted to sit down, wash, sleep, drink, pray, hold someone, avoid an argument, or find out whether the week's wages would cover what was owed. But the body was already making its testimony. It had stood in the mill, bent in the mine, endured the furnace, watched the machine, breathed the dust, and obeyed the clock. Now it moved toward the brief hours that belonged, at least partly, to the worker again. Those hours were never empty. They were filled with food, family, washing, errands, exhaustion, sometimes pleasure, sometimes anger, sometimes meetings, chapels, taverns, songs, organising, or silence. And before any of that could happen, before the worker could return fully to the household, there was the question that waited in every industrial evening and shaped every industrial morning after it. What did all of that labour buy, and how much of the worker's life had already been spent earning it? The first thought after the body has been standing too long is often food. Not food as pleasure, not food as an event, not a table laid out at home with time enough to speak and sit and notice the taste of things. Food in the industrial workday was practical, hurried, and measured against the clock. It was the thing that had to fit into the small break the factory allowed. It had to travel from home without spoiling too quickly, survive the heat or damp of the workplace, cost as little as possible, and give the body enough strength to return to the machine. That sounds simple until you imagine the worker after hours of noise and dust, hands dirty, mouth dry, ears still ringing, looking for a place to sit or lean with a tin pail, a cloth bundle, a piece of bread, a cold potato, or whatever could be spared from the household that morning. The meal was not separate from the workday. It was part of the machinery of survival. In many industrial districts, the midday meal was still called dinner, even if it was eaten from a pail, on a bench, in a yard beside a machine, underground, or in the corner of a crowded room. The word carried older habits with it. Before factory discipline reshaped time, dinner had often been the main meal of the day, eaten around noon or early afternoon, when the body needed fuel for the remaining work. Industrial workers kept the need, but lost much of the setting. The meal had to be compressed. A factory might allow half an hour, sometimes longer, sometimes less, depending on the period, the workplace, and the rules. Some workers went home if they lived close enough, but many could not. The walk would take too much time. The gate, the clock, and the risk of being late made home too far away even when it was only a few streets. So food came to work instead, and the dinner pail became one of the quiet objects of the industrial age. Picture one of those pails. It might be metal, practical, dented, blackened by use, with a handle worn smooth by the same hand carrying it day after day. In some places it was a tin dinner pail with stacked compartments, allowing a worker to carry bread, meat, potatoes, pie, or tea separately. In other places, especially for poorer workers or earlier in the period, the meal might be wrapped in cloth, tied in paper, carried in a basket, or tucked into a pocket. Miners often carried food underground, where it had to survive dust, damp, and the risk of contamination. Textile workers might bring food into the mill or eat in a yard if one was available. Iron workers and foundry workers needed food that could endure heat nearby, while workers in outdoor industrial labour ate whatever could be carried through weather. The container mattered because it showed how the household had prepared for the day. Someone had thought ahead. Someone had cooked or saved or wrapped or packed. Even when the worker packed it alone, the food represented labour done before paid labour began. For many working-class families, the meal inside the pail was plain. Bread was common because it travelled well and filled the stomach. Potatoes were common because they were cheap, familiar, and could be cooked at home in quantity. Oatcakes, cornbread, rye bread, biscuits, cheese, onions, cold bacon, sausage dripping, leftover stew thickened enough to carry, pies, pasties, and hand pies all appeared in different regions because they could be held, wrapped, and eaten without much equipment. In parts of Britain, the pasty became closely associated with miners and other workers because it was practical food. It enclosed meat, potato, onion, or turnip in a sturdy crust, could be carried into a workplace, and could be eaten with dirty hands by holding the crust. In some mining stories, the crimped edge was supposedly discarded because miners' hands were contaminated, though practices varied. What matters is not whether every detail of that tradition was universal. What matters is that industrial food had to solve industrial problems. It had to be portable, filling, cheap, and fast. Tea deserves its own place in this meal. In Britain especially, tea became central to working-class life during the industrial age. It was warm, mildly stimulating, and could make bread or dry food easier to swallow. It also required boiled water, which made it safer in places where water quality was poor. A worker might carry tea in a bottle or can, or return to a place where hot water could be obtained. In some factories, hot water or tea arrangements developed informally or formally. In other places, workers relied entirely on what they brought. Tea was not a luxury in this context. It was a tool for getting through the day. A hot drink could steady a worker in a cold yard, soften a hard meal, and offer a few minutes of comfort in a schedule that allowed very little. In American industrial towns, coffee often played a similar role, though tea was also common depending on the region and community. Immigrant workers brought food habits with them and adapted them to the factory day. An Irish labourer might carry potatoes and bread. A German worker might bring sausage, rye bread, or cabbage when possible. Italian, Polish, Jewish, Scandinavian, French-Canadian, and other immigrant communities added their own foodways to the industrial lunch, especially in the later 19th and early 20th centuries. The lunch pail became a small container of culture as well as calories. Inside, it might be the plainest evidence that a person belonged to a particular household, neighbourhood, language, or tradition. Even under the pressure of factory time, food carried memory. But for the poorest workers, there was very little romance in it. Some ate bread and tea day after day. Some had only potatoes. Some had no proper meal at all, and bought something cheap from a street seller when wages allowed. The body asked for fuel, but wages decided what kind. A heavy industrial job required strength, and strength required food, yet many workers lived in economies where the cheapest foods had to do most of the work. Bread prices, rent, coal, debt, illness, unemployment, and the number of mouths in the household all determined what appeared in the pail. A worker might smell another person's meat pie and keep eating dry bread. A child might carry food that looked too small for the length of the day ahead. A mother might pack better pieces for the wage earner and keep less for herself or for children at home. Food distribution inside poor families was often a quiet arithmetic of sacrifice. The break itself was brief enough to change how food was experienced. There is a difference between eating and being allowed to eat. The worker did not stop because the body chose the moment. The worker stopped because the schedule permitted it. When the bell rang for the meal, movement changed instantly. Machines slowed or stopped where they could be stopped. Workers left stations, reached for pails, moved toward benches, yards, walls, steps, or any place where sitting was possible. Some remained near the machinery because there was nowhere else to go. In dirty industries, washing before eating was difficult or impossible. Water might be limited. Time was limited. Soap was not guaranteed. Workers ate with hands marked by coal, oil, lint, dye, metal dust, or chemicals. Modern ideas of hygiene would have been hard to maintain under those conditions, even for workers who wanted them. The workplace set the terms. In textile mills, cotton dust could settle on food if the meal was eaten inside. In mines, coal dust could get into everything. In metal shops, grit and soot were constant companions. Workers tried to protect their meals as best they could. Food was wrapped tightly, kept in covered pails, tucked away from the worst dirt, or eaten quickly before the workplace could claim it. Still, the separation between labour and nourishment was thin. You could taste the room. A miner's bread might carry coal dust. A mill worker's food might be touched by lint. A foundry worker might eat in air still heavy with heat and smoke. The body took in food and workplace together. Some workers used the break to sleep for a few minutes. This detail appears again and again in accounts of long-hour labour. When the day is too long, food and sleep compete. A child might be so tired that eating becomes secondary. An adult might close the eyes after swallowing only part of the meal. In factories with very short breaks, a worker could not really rest, but even 5 minutes of sitting could feel necessary. The body made bargains: eat now and stay awake later, sleep now and be hungry later, drink tea and hope it carries you, save part of the food for the afternoon, finish everything and risk the long hunger before home. There was also social life in the meal break, and this mattered more than the schedule allowed. Workers who could not speak over the machinery might use the dinner break to recover language. They talked about wages, accidents, supervisors, weather, children, rent, food prices, politics, illness, courtship, strikes, rumours, and jokes too ordinary to survive in any record. A meal break was where private fatigue became shared knowledge. A worker might learn that another department had been fined, that a machine had injured someone, that a wage cut was coming, that a union meeting was planned, that a child was sick, that a landlord was raising rent, that a neighbour needed help. These conversations could be small and practical, but they formed part of the working class world. The factory brought people together under discipline, but the pause gave them a chance to recognise one another. Employers understood this, sometimes more clearly than workers realised. Breaks could be treated with suspicion, because idle conversation might become complaint, and complaint might become organisation. In some workplaces, rules tried to control where workers gathered or how long they remained away from machines. In paternalistic factories, employers might provide dining spaces, reading rooms, or controlled recreation, partly from genuine concern and partly from a desire to shape workers' behaviour. The industrial meal was never only about eating, it sat at the intersection of health, discipline, morality, class and power. A worker with time to sit and speak was not only recovering strength, that worker was also temporarily outside the direct rhythm of the machine. Women workers used meal breaks in particular ways because their lives often carried additional pressures. A young woman in a mill might eat with friends, sharing food, news and small confidences. A married woman might use the break to worry about children at home, or to mend something quickly, or to stretch food so that part could be taken back later. In some textile towns, women created strong workplace communities, supporting one another through illness, courtship, homesickness, family obligations and disputes with supervisors. In other places, competition, low wages, harassment or ethnic divisions made solidarity harder. The dinner pail could show inequality among women as clearly as among men. One worker had cheese, another had only bread, one had tea, another had nothing hot. One received food packed by a mother or sister, another packed for herself after cooking for others before dawn. Children's meal breaks were often the saddest to imagine, because they show the mismatch between industrial schedules and childhood needs. A child working in a mill or mine needed rest, warmth, food, and care. But the workplace offered only a timed pause. Some children ate what had been packed from home and then returned to tasks that demanded adult endurance. Others ran errands during breaks or used the time for small play, if energy remained. A child might be hungry and still trade a bite of food, or laugh with another child, or chase someone briefly in a yard until the bell sounded again. This is important to remember. Even in harsh conditions, children remained children. They made games in narrow spaces. They whispered. They teased. They tried to turn a crust, a stone, a scrap, or a few minutes of freedom into something that felt like life. Then the bell ended it. The quality of the break depended heavily on the industry. A worker in a large textile mill might have a regular meal time, however short. A dock labourer might eat when the flow of work allowed. A seamstress paid by the piece might barely stop because stopping meant earning less. A coal miner underground might eat in darkness or dim lamplight, sitting on the floor of the mine or in a rough space away from the immediate work. Food underground had its own character. Dust, damp, rats in some places, the smell of lamps, sweat, and coal made eating there far removed from any ordinary idea of dinner. Yet the meal could also be a moment of companionship. Men and boys sharing food in the mine might exchange stories, instructions, warnings, and the rough humour that dangerous work often produces. A joke underground could be more than amusement. It could be a way to prove that fear had not taken over. In ironworks, the timing of meals could be shaped by the process. Heat work did not always stop neatly. Furnaces, molten metal, rolling schedules, and team labour demanded coordination. Some workers ate between heats, or during pauses determined by production rather than by a general bell. Food near such work had to be simple and sturdy. The appetite produced by furnace labour could be enormous, but heat could also make eating difficult. Drinking was essential. Though safe and adequate, water was not always as available as it should have been. Alcohol formed part of working-class life in many industrial communities, and there were trades where drinking was woven into custom, sometimes as relief from pain, sometimes as social bonding, sometimes as a dangerous response to dangerous work. Reformers worried over drink constantly, and sometimes with reason, but moral criticism often ignored the conditions that made workers seek relief wherever it could be found. The midday pause also reveals the household behind the worker. Food had to be prepared before it could be carried. Someone boiled the potatoes, baked the bread, cut the cheese, saved the scraps, filled the bottle, wrapped the cloth, cleaned the pail, or made sure there was anything to take at all. In families where the mother also worked for wages, this preparation was squeezed into early morning or the night before. In families with older daughters, girls often helped pack food for fathers, brothers, mothers, or themselves. The dinner pail sitting by the door before dawn represented unpaid labour that made paid labour possible. This is one of the central hidden facts of the industrial age. The factory wage depended on the household that fed the worker, washed the clothes, raised the children, nursed the sick, and stretched the money. Industry looked modern, but it rested on domestic work that remained old, repetitive, and mostly uncounted. For workers living in boarding houses, meals could be more regulated. In early Lowell, for example, many young women lived in company-associated boarding houses where meals were provided under rules. That arrangement was designed to create order and respectability, and for some workers it offered a structured life away from home. Breakfast before work, dinner brought or taken depending on schedule, supper after the shift, shared rooms, rules about conduct, church attendance, visitors and curfews. It could feel protective, restrictive, or both. As hours lengthened and wages changed, the respectable image of the mill girl did not erase fatigue. A boarding house meal might be better than what some workers could manage alone, but it still fit around the factory bell. The table served the mill's schedule. Street food sellers and small shops formed another part of the industrial food system. Where workers gathered, someone found a way to sell cheap food. Pies, bread, hot potatoes, coffee, tea, soup. Sausages, fruit in season, fried fish later in the century in Britain, and other quick foods became part of urban working-class life. These sellers helped workers who had no time, no household support, or no adequate packed meal. They also created risks. Food quality varied. Adulteration was common in the 19th century before stronger regulation. Cheap food could be filling but poor in nutrition. Still, to a hungry worker, a hot potato or meat pie at the gate could be the best part of the day. The lunch pail also marked respectability. A worker who brought food from home appeared steady, prepared, tied to a household. A man whose wife packed a substantial meal could feel the support of domestic stability. A young worker carrying a neat pail might signal self-discipline. Reformers and employers often like the image of the sober worker eating simple food, avoiding the tavern and returning promptly to work. Workers themselves also valued respectability, because it could protect dignity in a society that often treated poverty as moral failure. But respectability had a cost. It required steady wages, domestic labour, clean clothes, food to pack, and time to prepare. The poorest workers were often judged for failing to display habits that poverty made difficult. The smell of the meal break must have been strong. Bread, onions, tea, sweat, oil, dust, damp wool, hot metal, coal smoke, tobacco, and whatever food had been packed that day. In some workplaces, men smoked pipes during breaks if allowed. Smoke mixed with smoke. A worker might sit on a low wall outside a mill and eat while the same factory that employed him loomed overhead. A girl might stand with friends in a yard because there was nowhere comfortable to sit. A child might hold a potato in both hands for warmth before eating it. A miner might unwrap bread with blackened fingers. A seamstress might eat without leaving the bench because each minute away from stitching meant fewer pieces completed. The body took what it could get. There is a modern temptation to ask whether the food was healthy. That question is not wrong, but it can become misleading if we ask it too neatly. Industrial workers needed calories first. Protein, vitamins, variety and cleanliness mattered, but survival often narrowed the menu. Bread and tea might not have been ideal, but they were available. Potatoes could sustain people remarkably well when combined with other foods, but dependence on cheap staples made families vulnerable. Meat was valued when affordable, especially bacon, sausage, stews, pies, or cheap cuts. Sugar became increasingly important in working-class diets because it provided quick energy and made tea more satisfying. Jam, treacle, and sweetened tea were not just treats. They were affordable calories. The industrial age produced not only machines but new food habits, including the growing use of refined sugar and mass-produced foods that changed working-class diets over time. The meal break could also be a time for reading. In some workplaces and communities, literate workers read newspapers, pamphlets, religious tracts, union materials, or serialized fiction during breaks or before and after shifts. One worker might read aloud to others when the setting allowed it. In cigar factories later in the 19th century, especially in Cuban and immigrant traditions, readers were famously employed to read literature and newspapers aloud to workers, though that was a different industrial context from the noisy textile mill. Still, the broader point holds. Workers used scraps of time for more than eating. They learned, argued, prayed, organised, courted, and imagined. The factory tried to define the break as a pause for restoring labour power. Workers often made it into something more human. The end of the meal break came too soon. That is one of the easiest parts of the day to understand across time. The food is not quite settled. The tea is gone or cold. The body has begun to enjoy sitting. A conversation has just reached the interesting part. Someone is still chewing. Someone is rubbing a sore wrist. Someone has closed their eyes for a moment too long. Then the bell, whistle, shout, or movement of others brings the pause to an end. The worker packs away the empty cloth or pail, wipes hands if possible, rises from the step or bench, and returns to the room. The hardest part of the meal break may be that it proves rest is possible and then removes it. The body remembers the feeling of sitting down just as it is required to stand again. After eating, the factory could feel worse. Heat pressed more heavily. Noise seemed sharper after a brief interval of speech. Dust returned to the throat. The stomach, newly filled or still unsatisfied, had to endure bending, lifting, standing, and moving. Workers who had eaten too little faced weakness. Workers who had eaten quickly faced discomfort. In either case, the second half of the day demanded payment. The meal did not refresh in the way a long rest might. It merely made continuation possible. This is why the dinner pail is such a useful object to hold in mind. It is small enough to carry in one hand, but it contains an entire system. Wages, household labour, gender roles, food prices, industrial discipline, migration, poverty, culture, health, and time all meet inside it. A piece of bread in a pail is not just bread. It is grain grown somewhere, flour milled somewhere, money spent or saved, hands that baked or bought it, a family that divided it, and a worker who will use it to stand another 6 hours. A cold potato is not just a potato. It is the difference between faintness and endurance. A slice of meat is not just meat. It is a sign that wages, luck, or sacrifice allowed something more than the minimum that day. A tin of tea is not just a drink. It is warmth in a cold yard, a stimulant in a long shift, and a small comfort under authority. When the worker returns to the machine, the pail is lighter. That matters in a practical sense, but it also carries a feeling. The food packed that morning has been spent just as the body is being spent. There may be nothing left until home. Some workers saved a piece for later, especially if the day was long or the walk back would be difficult. A child might hide a bit of bread. A man might leave half an onion or crust in the pail. A woman might think of someone at home and not finish what she had brought. The industrial meal was shaped not only by hunger, but by worry. Food could be eaten now or saved against uncertainty. Poor people often become experts in delaying hunger, not because it is noble, but because the day requires it. The machines begin again, or they seem to grow louder because the brief human interval has ended. The worker's hands return to the task. The overseer resumes watching. The clock resumes its full authority. Outside, sellers pack up, children run errands, carts pass, and smoke continues to darken the afternoon. Inside, the meal becomes memory almost immediately. Its purpose was never to linger. It was there to carry the body forward, and now the body is moving again. By this point in the day, the work begins to reveal its inequalities more sharply. Adult men, women, boys, girls, skilled workers, unskilled labourers, apprentices, migrants, widows, orphans, and whole families did not meet the industrial age on equal terms. Some were paid more, some less. Some had a little bargaining power, others almost none. Some could leave a bad job, many could not. The same bell called them back, but it did not call them back to the same risks. And among the people returning from that short break were those the industrial system used most easily, because they had the fewest protections and the smallest voices in the room. Among the people returning from that short meal break were the workers the industrial age found easiest to use and slowest to protect. Women whose wages were treated as secondary, even when their families depended on them. Children small enough to fit under machines, through mine passages, behind looms, into corners of workshops where an adult body could not easily go. Boys sent into pits before they fully understood the danger overhead. Girls standing in spinning rooms with lint in their hair and dust in their lungs. Young women in match factories handling chemicals that could rot the jawbone. Seamstresses bending over fabric until their eyes burned and the candle or gaslight made the needle blur. Domestic servants climbing stairs from before dawn until long after factory workers had left their mills. Laundresses with arms deep in hot water and lye. pottery workers breathing dust and lead. The phrase industrial worker can sound solid and masculine, like a man with a cap, a lunch pail and a strong back walking toward a factory gate. That man was real. He mattered. But he was never the whole story. The industrial age was also built by people whose labour was cheaper, because society considered them weaker, more obedient, more replaceable, or less deserving of a full wage. And this is where the workday becomes harder to look at directly, because the machines did not only change how things were made, they changed who could be used to make them. The factory owner looking across a spinning room did not see childhood in the way we do. He saw hands, he saw reach, he saw smallness as an advantage. A child could crawl under machinery to collect waste cotton. A child could tie broken threads quickly. A child could move between frames where an adult would have to bend awkwardly. A child could be trained early, paid little, and corrected harshly. To modern ears, that sounds like a moral failure so obvious that it should have stopped itself. But the people living inside that world did not always see the line where we see it. Some did, of course. Reformers, doctors, workers, parents, ministers and investigators increasingly protested child labour during the 19th century. But for many poor families, the question was not whether a child ought to spend long days in a mill. The question was whether the rent could be paid without that child's wage. Poverty has a way of making cruelty look like necessity. It narrows the moral world until the choice is not between good and bad, but between bad and worse. In Britain, textile mills became one of the great battlegrounds over child labour. Children were employed as piecers, scavengers, doffers, and helpers, moving through rooms full of spinning machinery and power looms. The work could be monotonous, exhausting, and dangerous, especially when machines were not stopped for cleaning or adjustment. A scavenger might have to pick up loose cotton from beneath moving equipment. A piecer had to mend broken threads quickly enough to keep production from slowing. A doffer removed full bobbins and replaced them with empty ones, a task requiring speed and constant movement. These jobs were not always described as skilled in the way adult trades were, but that does not mean they were easy. A child had to learn where to stand, when to duck, how to move close to danger without being caught by it, and how to do all of this while tired. The room was loud enough to swallow warning shouts. The floor could be slick. The air could be thick with lint. The overseer might be impatient. The machine did not pause because the person beside it was 8, 10, or 12 years old. Some of the earliest factory reform laws focused on children, because even many people comfortable with hard work for adults began to worry about what long industrial hours did to the young. The British Factory Act of 1833 limited the working hours of children in textile mills and required some schooling for child workers, though enforcement was difficult at first, and factory inspectors were too few for the scale of the problem. Before such laws, and even after them in places where rules were ignored or worked around, children could spend 12 hours or more inside industrial workplaces. They woke before dawn, walked through the same smoke as adults, entered the same rooms, breathed the same air, and then had to grow while giving their strength to someone else's production schedule. A tired adult at the end of a 12-hour day is one thing. A tired child at the end of that day is another. The body has less reserve. The mind has less patience. The need for sleep is greater, and still the bell rang the same. In coal mines, the situation could be even more disturbing. Children worked underground in roles that were shaped by their size and low cost. Some boys worked as trappers, sitting alone in the dark to open and close ventilation doors for passing coal carts. It was not always heavy labour, but it could mean long hours in isolation, underground, with only a small lamp or sometimes very little light, listening for approaching carts and waiting in darkness. Other children hauled coal, pushed carts, carried loads, or assisted older workers. In narrow seams, small bodies were useful because the mine itself was cramped. The 1842 Mines and Collieries Act in Britain banned women and girls from working underground, and set limits on boys under a certain age. But the very existence of that law tells us what had been happening before it. Women and children had been underground, dragging, hauling, carrying, breathing coal dust, moving through wet and dangerous passages, and doing so because the coal economy had room for their labour and very little concern for what that labour cost them. Try to picture a child sitting by a trapdoor in a mine, not in a storybook cave, not in adventure darkness, but in working darkness. The air is damp, the sounds are irregular. Somewhere far off there is the strike of tools, the movement of carts, men's voices, the creak of timber, the drip of water. The child's job is to open the door when needed and close it again to maintain ventilation. It is simple work in one sense, but it demands attention, and the price of failure may be anger or danger. Hours pass slowly in darkness. A child may become sleepy, frightened, bored, cold, hungry, or numb. Records from reform investigations include testimony that is difficult to forget because the children speak plainly. They do not describe themselves as symbols of injustice. They describe the work, what time they begin, what they carry, whether they see daylight, whether they are beaten, whether they are tired. That plainness is what makes it so hard. The facts do not need decoration. Women in industrial labour faced a different kind of invisibility. Their work was everywhere, but it was often described as if it mattered less. In textile mills, women formed a large part of the workforce, especially in spinning and weaving districts. In some places, they were preferred for certain tasks because employers believed they were more manageable, more careful, or simply cheaper. A woman could work long hours at machines, produce profit, contribute essential household income, and still be told that her true place was in the home. That contradiction ran through the industrial age. Society needed women's wages but often refused to respect women's wage labour. It depended on their earnings while treating those earnings as supplementary. It praised domestic womanhood while sending poor women into mills, mines before legal restrictions, workshops, laundries, match factories, and service, because hunger did not care about ideals. A young woman in a mill might begin work as a teenager, sometimes younger, and spend her days in a room full of heat, motion, and noise. She might enjoy parts of it. That is important to say. Factory work could provide wages, friendships, independence from family control, and a social world beyond the home. In early mill towns in New England, some young women used wages to support families, buy books, attend lectures, write, and imagine possibilities not easily available in rural life. But those opportunities existed within a strict industrial frame. The hours were long, the machines were fast, the air was poor, wages could be cut, rules could be controlling, boarding houses could provide community and surveillance at the same time. The respectable image of the mill girl was useful to employers because it made factory labour seem orderly and safe. The actual women knew the truth was more complicated. They could be proud of the earning money and angry about conditions. They could value companionship and resent the bell. They could want independence and still be exhausted. Outside the large mills, women's industrial labour often became even less visible. Seamstresses, shirt makers and garment workers might labour at home or in crowded workshops, paid by the piece rather than by the hour. Piecework created a cruel kind of freedom. No bell might ring over the worker's head, no overseer might stand beside her, but the pressure of payment followed every stitch. If she stopped, she earned nothing. If the rate was low, she had to work faster or longer. In the 19th century garment trades, women and girls could sew late into the night by candle, oil lamp or gaslight, shoulders bent, eyes strained, fingers cramped, producing clothing that might be worn by people who never imagined the labour hidden in the seams. This was industrial work too, even when it happened in a rented room rather than a factory building. The industrial age did not only concentrate workers under one roof, it also pushed work into homes and small shops where poverty made regulation harder and suffering easier to ignore. Dangerous jobs were often assigned according to class, gender, age, and desperation. Match workers, many of them women and girls, handled white phosphorus in factories that produced the small modern convenience of the match. The match seems harmless once it sits in a box ready to strike, but the chemical processes behind it could be brutal. Workers exposed to white phosphorus could develop phosphorus necrosis of the jaw, known as phossy jaw, a painful and disfiguring disease in which the jawbone became infected and decayed. The smell, pain, swelling, and eventual damage could be terrible. In London, the famous Match Girls strike of 1888 at Bryanton May became a key moment in labour history because it drew attention to low wages, fines, dangerous conditions, and the capacity of young women workers to organise. These women were often dismissed by polite society as unskilled and powerless, yet they stood together and forced public attention. That matters. The workers no one protected were not always silent. Sometimes they became the people who changed the conversation. Pottery workers faced another kind of danger. In the Staffordshire potteries and other ceramic centres, lead glazes and dust created serious health risks. Workers could suffer from lead poisoning, which affected the nervous system, digestion, reproductive health, and general strength. Dust from clay and flint damaged lungs. Women and children worked in parts of the trade, sometimes in processes that exposed them to harmful substances while paying them low wages. A plate or cup on a middle-class table could pass through many hands before it arrived clean, decorated, and respectable. Some of those hands had trembled from poison, some lungs had filled with dust. Industrial goods often looked smooth because the damage had been left behind in the workers. Laundries were another hard world, and because washing was associated with women's domestic work, it was often underestimated. Industrial and commercial laundries, as well as women taking in washing at home, involved heavy wet labour. Clothes, linens, uniforms, sheets, and household textiles had to be soaked, scrubbed, boiled, beaten, wrung, lifted, dried, ironed, and folded. Wet cloth is heavy. Steam fills the lungs. Lye and harsh soaps damage the hands. Heat from boiling tubs and irons can be exhausting. A washerwoman might stand for hours in damp conditions, then carry bundles through streets. This work did not always have the dramatic machinery of a mill, but it wore the body down with relentless repetition. It also linked class divisions very clearly. One woman's clean linen could be another woman's swollen hands. Domestic service belongs in this story because it was one of the largest forms of employment for women during the industrial age, even if it was not factory labour. Many young women entered service as maids, cooks, cleaners, nursemaids, and general servants, often working extremely long days under constant supervision. A servant's day could begin before the household woke and end after the household slept. Fires had to be lit, grates cleaned, water carried, stairs scrubbed, meals prepared, bells answered, children watched, laundry managed, rooms cleaned, and errands run. In a middle-class home, industrial modernity might appear as comfort. Brighter lamps, more goods, cleaner clothing, better meals, more furniture. Behind that comfort stood servants whose labour converted money into daily ease for others. They were not standing beside power looms, but their lives were also disciplined by class, time, and the demands of a changing economy. Danger in industrial work was not only the spectacular accident, it was also the slow wearing away of health. A machine could take a hand in seconds, but dust could take lungs over years. Lead could poison gradually. Repetition could damage joints quietly. Malnutrition could weaken a body until ordinary illness became serious. Pregnancy under conditions of hard labour could be risky. Children deprived of rest and schooling could carry the effects into adulthood. The industrial age created many kinds of injury, and the slow ones were easier for employers and society to deny because they did not happen in one visible moment. A worker who coughed for 10 years could be blamed on bad housing, weak constitution, city air, or personal habits. The workplace disappeared into the background, even when it was the source of the harm. Protection, when it came unevenly. Laws were passed in stages, often after long campaigns and bitter arguments. Factory Acts limited hours for children and women in certain industries before adult men received similar protections in many places. Mines legislation removed women and young children from underground work in Britain, though not because society suddenly believed in equality. Often, reformers argued that women and children needed protection because they were physically weaker or morally vulnerable, while adult men were expected to endure. This created a strange pattern. Women and children were sometimes protected because they were seen as dependent, but that same view justified lower wages and less authority. Protection could reduce some abuses while reinforcing other inequalities. History rarely moves cleanly. Employers resisted many reforms by warning that reduced hours would destroy competitiveness, raise prices, or harm the very families reformers hoped to help. Some families also feared restrictions if they meant losing a child's wage. This is another uncomfortable piece of the story. A law that protected children from long hours could also reduce household income unless adult wages rose or other support existed. Reformers might speak of childhood, schooling and health, while parents looked at rent due on Saturday. Both could be right about different parts of the problem. A child should not be sacrificed to industry. A family should not be pushed into hunger because the child's wage disappears. Real reform had to confront the wage system itself, not merely remove the youngest workers from it. Schools became part of the debate because child labour stole time as much as strength. In theory, education offered a way out of dependency and ignorance. In practice, a child who worked long hours had little energy for learning. Half-time systems, evening schools, Sunday schools and factory schools attempted to combine work and education, but the results varied widely. A child who had spent hours in a mill might sit before a teacher with heavy eyes and a tired hand. The alphabet competes poorly with exhaustion. Still, many working-class families valued education deeply when it was available. They understood that reading, writing and arithmetic could open doors, or at least protect a person from certain forms of exploitation. The tragedy is that children most in need of opportunity often had the least time and strength to pursue it. The moral language around women and child workers could be patronising, but the workers themselves were not merely objects of pity. They resisted in many ways. Children ran away from harsh apprenticeships. Women joined strikes. Female textile workers protested wage cuts in Lowell in the 1830s and 1840s. Match girls organised. Garment workers formed unions and mutual aid networks. Miners and their families participated in labour struggles. Domestic servants left bad positions when they could. Workers shared warnings about dangerous employers. Mothers lied about ages to get children work and sometimes lied to keep them out of it. People navigated the system with the tools available to them, and those tools were often limited, but not non-existent. Workplace danger also created family danger. When a worker was injured, the home absorbed the consequences. A woman whose husband was killed in a mine might have to send children to work sooner, take in washing, enter service, rely on parish relief, remarry, move, or fall into destitution. A child injured in a factory might require care from someone already overworked. A mother poisoned or weakened by factory labour might be unable to nurse or care for infants. Industrial accidents therefore spread beyond the workplace. The machine harmed not only the body it touched, but the household that depended on that body. A funeral procession in an industrial town was often an economic event, as well as a personal grief. There was a public appetite for the products of this labour. Cheap cloth changed ordinary life. Matches made fire easier. Coal heated homes and powered engines. Iron and steel built railways, bridges, ships, tools and machines. Pottery filled tables. Ready-made garments clothed growing populations. These goods were not imaginary benefits. They mattered. The industrial age raised production and eventually contributed to higher living standards for many people, though the benefits came unevenly and often after generations of struggle. The difficulty is holding both truths at once. Industrial production made modern life possible, and it did so by consuming the time, health, and childhood of people with very little power. A cotton dress could be cheaper because women and children worked long hours in mills. A match could be convenient because girls handled poison. A clean shirt could appear in a drawer because another woman spent her day in steam and soap. Progress had a bill, and the poorest often paid it first. Inside the workplace, the social order was visible in who could be shouted at, who could be touched, who could be fined, who could be dismissed, and who could complain safely. Women and children were especially vulnerable to abuse by supervisors because their economic position was weaker and their reputations easier to threaten. Harassment did not need to be recorded in official reports to exist. It lived in comments, pressure, favoritism, intimidation, and the knowledge that speaking up might cost work. Children could be beaten or roughly handled in some workplaces, especially earlier in the period and in less regulated settings. Apprentices and pauper children sent from workhouses to mills were particularly vulnerable because they were separated from family protection. The language of apprenticeship could make exploitation sound like training. The child still felt the hunger, the fatigue, and the blow. Pauper apprentices deserve attention because they reveal the harsh logic of early industrial labour. In Britain, parish authorities sometimes sent poor children to work in mills under apprenticeship arrangements. Factory owners received labour. Parishes reduced the burden of supporting poor children. In theory, the child received training and maintenance. In practice, conditions could be harsh, isolated and abusive, especially when children were housed away from families and dependent on employers for food, lodging, discipline and work. The apprentice system blurred welfare and exploitation in a way that should make us uneasy. The child was treated as a problem to be placed somewhere useful. Usefulness became the standard by which their life was organised. The age of a worker was not always easy to verify. Birth records could be incomplete. Families might not know exact ages. Employers might not ask too carefully. Children could appear older or be presented as older to satisfy rules. Inspectors, where they existed, faced evasion. A law on paper had to travel through factory gates, local relationships, economic pressure, and the willingness of authorities to enforce it. This is why reform was never simply the passing of an act. It was the slow building of inspection systems, public expectations, worker pressure, legal penalties, and cultural change. The law could declare that a child should not work beyond a certain number of hours. The factory floor had to be made to obey. As the afternoon deepened, the most vulnerable workers carried fatigue differently. A grown man might feel his strength declining and still have the size to protect himself somewhat from the room. A child did not. A woman might know a machine, a process, a supervisor, and a danger as well as any man, but receive less pay and less respect. In a dangerous trade, experience helped, but poverty pushed people to accept risks that experience could not remove. The workday pressed hardest on those with the least ability to refuse it. That is the plain centre of this part of the story. Industrial labour was not equally harsh for everyone. It found weakness in the social order and built wages around it. And still, at the end of the day, these workers walked out with the others. The mill girl with cotton dust on her dress. The boy from the mine blinking in the outside light. The matchworker with aching jaw and stained fingers. The seamstress carrying unfinished work home because the pay was by the piece. The servant sent on one last errand after already working since dawn. The laundress with arms sore from wringing. The child too tired to speak. They were not footnotes to the industrial age. They were central to it. The ordinary workday cannot be understood without them because the system depended on their cheapness, their endurance, and their lack of protection. When we think about the industrial worker coming home at dusk or later, it is easy to imagine only the adult male wage earner returning to a waiting household. But in many streets, the household returned in pieces. A daughter from the mill, a son from the workshop, a mother from laundry or factory work, a father from the pit or yard. a younger child who had spent the day minding an infant or doing errands, everyone carrying some part of the economy on their body. The evening did not begin with rest. It began with the gathering of exhausted people into rooms that still needed fire, food, washing, repair and care. Before anyone could sleep, wages had to be counted, debts remembered, injuries examined, children quieted, clothes cleaned as best they could be, and tomorrow prepared. The factory had taken the day, but the household still demanded what was left, and in that narrow space between paid labour and sleep, the true cost of the workday began to show itself in coins, in hunger, in silence, and in the slow way a tired person lowers themselves into a chair. The factory bell released the worker, but it did not return what the day had taken. That is the first thing to understand about coming home in the industrial age. The end of the shift was not the end of a labour in any complete sense. It was only the moment when the body was allowed to leave the place where wages were earned. The worker still had to walk through the same smoke-filled streets, still had to carry soreness back into the household, still had to face rent, food, coal, laundry, children, illness, repairs, debts, and the simple fact that tomorrow would ask the same body to rise again. When the gates opened at evening, the people who came out did not step into leisure, the way many modern workers might hope to after a long day. They stepped into the second half of survival. Picture the street outside the mill as the workers emerge. The light is already fading, or in winter it may be fully gone. The morning crowd reforms in reverse, but it is slower now. Boots drag more than they did before dawn. Voices are rougher. Some workers are too tired to speak. Others begin talking immediately because the noise of the mill has finally stopped, and language returns all at once, like something that had been held down for hours. Women call to friends. Men complain about machines, overseers, prices, wages, or the cold. Children spill out in small groups, their faces marked by lint, coal dust, sweat, or the blank heaviness that comes when a child has had to behave like an adult for too many hours. The street takes them back, but the street is not gentle. It is crowded, muddy, smoky, and full of other workers leaving other places. Carts still move, horses still strain. Shops are closing or filling with people buying what they can before going home. Chimneys keep working above everything, as if the town itself has no interest in sleep. The walk home could feel longer than the walk to work. In the morning there had at least been urgency. A person had to arrive before the bell, and urgency can lend the body a kind of temporary strength. In the evening there was no such sharp push, unless the worker had errands to run, children to collect, food to buy, or a second job waiting. The legs simply had to continue. A woman who had stood all day in a spinning room might carry her dinner pail in one hand and a bundle of mending or purchased food in the other. A miner might walk with coal dust so deeply settled into his skin that washing would remove only part of it. An iron worker might still feel the furnace heat in his face even in cold air. A seamstress who had spent the day indoors might carry unfinished work home to continue by lamplight, because the piece rate did not care that her eyes hurt. The body left the workplace, but the work followed it. Wages were often waiting in the mine before the worker even reached home. In many industrial communities, pay was weekly, sometimes fortnightly, sometimes irregular depending on the job, the employer, the system, and the worker's status. Payday had its own emotional weather. A household might be strained all week waiting for it. Debts at the grocer or shopkeeper had to be settled. Rent might be due. Coal had to be bought. Bread, potatoes, tea, sugar, candles, soap, milk, or meat, if possible, had to be considered in order, because money did not stretch by wishing. The wage packet, when opened, could bring relief and disappointment at the same time. It was proof that the week had been endured. It was also proof of how little that endurance bought. Some workers were paid in cash, but abuses existed in different places and periods. The truck system, where workers were paid partly or wholly in goods, Tokens or credit usable at employer-controlled shops was widely criticised and restricted by law in Britain over time because it allowed employers or intermediaries to profit from workers twice, once from labour and again from the purchase of necessities. Even where workers received ordinary wages, debt could trap them. A family that bought food on credit during the week might see much of payday vanish at once. A landlord might collect rent before anything else could be planned. A sick child, broken boots, a funeral, a doctor, or lost work days could throw the whole calculation into disorder. The wage was not simply income, it was an argument with need. There is something very revealing about the way working families handled money in this period. The household economy was often managed in small sums: pennies, halfpennies, cents, shillings, francs, pfennigs, whatever the local currency. The poor knew the value of small coins intimately because small coins decided meals. A few pennies could mean bread, a missed day could mean debt, a wage cut could mean a child sent to work sooner, a rise in coal prices could mean a colder room. In middle-class accounts of the industrial age, wages often appear as numbers in tables: 15 shillings a week, 9 shillings, 5 shillings, a few dollars, a child's small contribution, a woman's lower rate. Those numbers matter, but they become real only when you put them beside a loaf, a rent bill, a coal scuttle, a pawn ticket, a doctor's fee, and the faces around the table. The pawn shop was part of industrial life in many towns. This is easy to miss if you imagine poverty as a simple lack of things. Poor families often owned useful objects, but those objects moved in and out of pawn according to the rhythm of wages. A coat might be pawned during the week and redeemed on payday. Tools, bedding, Sunday clothes, boots, shawls, pots, or small household items could become temporary sources of cash. Pawning was not always a sign of collapse. For many households, it was part of regular budgeting, a way to bridge the dangerous gap between need and pay, but it also shows how narrow the margin was. If the family could not redeem the item, it might be lost. If winter came and the coat was still in pawn, the cost became physical. When the worker reached home, the room might be warm, cold, noisy, empty, crowded, or tense depending on the household. In a working-class industrial district, home was rarely the private retreat imagined in middle-class writing of the period. It might be one room or two shared by parents, children, lodgers, relatives, and sometimes boarders taken in to help pay rent. The air might be thick from coal smoke, cooking, damp clothing, unwashed bodies, chamber pots, and the closeness of people living with too little space. If the worker was lucky, there was a fire. If coal was low, the fire might be small. If the family had no fuel, the room might be cold enough that keeping on outdoor clothing indoors was normal. The home was not automatically comfort. It had to be made comfortable by labour, and much of that labour was waiting after the paid workday ended. For a man returning from a mill, mine, foundry, railway yard, dock or workshop, the evening might hold a meal, washing, a few minutes with children, a visit to a tavern, chapel, union room, friendly society meeting, political gathering, or bed. His experience depended on wages, family structure, custom, health, and temperament. Some men came home and sat in exhausted silence. Some were tender, some were irritable. Some went out again because the home was too crowded, too stressful, or too full of demands after a day under supervision. Taverns and public houses were criticised constantly by reformers, and there were real problems with drink in working-class communities, especially where wages disappeared into alcohol and families suffered. But taverns were also warm, lit, social spaces in towns where home might be cramped and miserable. A man seeking a drink might be seeking more than alcohol. He might be seeking conversation, heat, credit, news, company, or a few minutes in a room where he was not being ordered by an overseer or surrounded by crying children. For women, coming home after wage labour often meant beginning the work that polite society claimed was their real duty. Food had to be prepared. Children had to be washed, fed, scolded, comforted, or put to bed. Clothes had to be mended. Water might have to be fetched. Coal had to be managed carefully. A baby needed nursing. An older child needed attention. A husband's clothes might need cleaning for the next day. If the woman worked in a mill, she came home with a tired body and entered domestic labour with no clean border between the two. If she did not work for wages outside the home, the evening was still not empty. She may have spent the day taking in washing, sewing by the piece, shopping, cooking, cleaning, caring for children, managing lodgers, and stretching money. The idea of the male worker returning from industry to a restful home often depended on a woman whose own exhaustion was made invisible. The evening meal in an industrial household was shaped by time and money. It might be bread and tea, potatoes, soup, porridge, stew stretched thin, fried bacon if wages allowed, dripping spread on bread, cheese, onions, leftovers from earlier. In some places, fish became an important working-class food, especially as railways made distribution easier and fried fish shops spread in Britain during the later 19th century. Meat was valued, but not always available in quantity. The meal had to be filling enough to quiet hunger, and cheap enough not to ruin the week. If several family members earned wages, the table might be better supplied. If work was irregular, it could be bare. Children learned the household's condition by what appeared at supper, whether adults said it aloud or not. Washing after work was its own problem. Industrial dirt was not ordinary dirt. Coal dust clung. Oil seeped. Cotton lint stuck. Sweat dried into clothing. Soot settled into hair. In homes without running water, washing required water carried from a pump, well, yard, or shared source, then heated if warmth was needed. A miner might wash in a tub or basin, but getting truly clean could be difficult. In many mining districts, pithead baths came much later. For much of the industrial age, the worker brought the mine home on his skin and clothing. A mother washing industrial clothes had to deal with the dirt of the workplace directly. Laundry was labour, and industrial labour created more of it. Children returning from work entered a strange evening. They were workers, but they were also children. Some had to help at home after their shifts. Some attended evening school if one was available, and if they had enough strength. Some ran into the street to play because childhood will take any opening it can find. The streets of industrial towns became playgrounds not because they were safe, but because there was nowhere else. Children played among carts, gutters, animals, refuse, smoke, and older boys or adults moving through the same spaces. A child who had spent the day in a mill might still chase another child down an alley at dusk. That does not mean the day had been easy. It means life kept pushing up through the cracks. Schooling, where it fit into working-class life, often came in tired hours. Evening schools, Sunday schools, charity schools, factory schools, and later public systems tried to reach children whose labour made ordinary education difficult. A child might learn letters after work with hands still dirty from the factory. Adults too attended lectures, reading rooms, mechanics institutes, union education sessions, chapels, or self-improvement classes when they could. The industrial age produced exhaustion, but also a hunger for learning among many working people. Books, newspapers, pamphlets, and political speeches circulated through industrial towns. A worker might be physically worn down and intellectually alive. That combination appears again and again in labour history. People with very little leisure used what little they had fiercely. The evening was also when injuries were inspected. A cut from the day, a burn, a bruise, a cough that had worsened, a child's sore fingers, a swollen ankle, a back strain, eyes reddened from dust or light. Some injuries were treated at home because doctors cost money. Remedies were practical and often improvised. Washing, bandaging, poultices, rest, if rest could be managed, advice from neighbours, help from older women with experience. Serious injuries could push the family toward a doctor, hospital, infirmary, employer aid if available, a friendly society, or charity. But seeking help meant cost, time, and sometimes lost wages. Many working people endured pain because endurance was cheaper than treatment. Friendly societies and mutual aid groups became important in this world because ordinary workers understood that illness and death were not remote possibilities. Members paid small, regular contributions to support one another during sickness, unemployment, or funerals. These societies were not charity in the condescending sense. They were working people building their own fragile protections in a world that offered few. A funeral benefit mattered because a decent burial carried dignity, and because death without money could bring humiliation as well as grief. Trade unions, burial clubs, benefit societies, religious groups, and neighbourhood networks all formed part of the social safety net before modern welfare systems existed. The evening after work was often when meetings happened, dues were paid, speeches were heard, and collective life took shape. Chapel and church also belonged to the industrial evening and weekend. In many working-class communities, especially in Britain, nonconformist chapels provided not only religion, but education, music, mutual aid, discipline, and a space for public speaking. A worker might attend prayer meeting after a long shift. A woman might find community there beyond the home and factory. Children might learn hymns and letters. Religious life could encourage obedience and patience, but it could also nourish reform, literacy, temperance, abolitionism, labour organisation, and political confidence. The same room where people prayed might also teach them how to speak in public, keep accounts, run committees, and imagine themselves as moral citizens rather than merely hands for hire. The home evening could be affectionate too. It is important not to make these rooms only miserable. Working people loved one another. They told jokes, shared food, sang songs, courted, held babies, celebrated small purchases, admired a new pair of boots, patched old clothes carefully, saved for a better room, listened to someone read, played with children, kept birds or dogs, grew plants in windows, decorated mantels, and found pride in cleanliness even when cleanliness was difficult. A poor industrial home could be crowded and smoky and still contain tenderness. A mother might save the best bite for a child. A father might bring home a small treat on payday. Siblings might share a bed and whisper until sleep came. Neighbours might lend coal, mind children, help during childbirth, or sit with the sick. The industrial age created harsh conditions, but it did not erase domestic feeling. Still, the pressure of money was always near. Rent collectors, shop debts, pawn tickets, school fees where they existed, burial club dues, union dues, coal costs, food prices, and the fear of unemployment shaped the emotional life of the household. A wage cut was not an abstract reduction. It changed supper. A strike was not only a political act. It meant days or weeks of hardship sustained by savings, union funds, credit, and neighbourhood solidarity. An injury was not only pain, it was a rent problem. A sick child was not only worry. It could mean a mother missing work or spending money that had been meant for food. Industrial families lived in constant relation to small financial shocks. Payday evenings could be lively, streets filled, markets stayed busy. Shops received customers who had waited all week. Some wages went directly to wives or mothers for household management. Some men handed over most earnings and kept spending money. Some did not, and family conflict followed. Women often became expert household economists, stretching inadequate wages with skill that no ledger honoured. They knew which shop extended credit, which seller gave fair weight, which foods filled children longest, how to reuse leftovers, how to patch clothes until patching became almost a second fabric, how to keep a fire low without letting it die, and when something had to go to pawn. Their work made industrial wages survivable. For single workers, especially young men and women lodging away from family, the evening had different possibilities. A young woman in a boarding house might share supper with other workers, write letters home, read, attend a lecture, sew, wash clothing, or collapse into bed. A young man lodging with other men might seek food, company, drink, entertainment, political meetings, or simply sleep. Industrial towns created new social freedoms along with new dangers. Young people away from family oversight could earn wages, choose friends, court, join associations, and encounter ideas beyond their birthplace. They could also be exploited, lonely, tempted into debt, or trapped in unsafe housing. The evening after work was the space where independence and vulnerability often met. Entertainment mattered because people cannot live on endurance alone. Music halls, taverns, dances, fairs, cheap theatres, street performers, sports, reading rooms, clubs, and later cinemas offered release. Reformers sometimes worried that workers wasted wages on pleasure. Workers often understood pleasure as necessary. After 6 days of smoke, dust, noise, and command, a song, a drink, a dance, a newspaper, a political speech, a football match, or an evening walk could restore some sense of being more than labour. Leisure was not empty. It was a claim, however small, that life contained something beyond production. The body, however, set limits. Many workers were simply too tired for much beyond eating and sleep. Sleep itself was shaped by housing. In crowded homes, several people might share a bed. Lodgers might sleep in shifts. Noise from neighbours, streets, babies, coughing, drunken arguments, animals, factories, trains and carts could interrupt rest. Bedding might be damp or inadequate. In some industrial districts, overcrowding was so severe that sleep was another form of compromise. The worker who needed deep recovery after 12 hours might get only a few broken hours before the morning bell or knocker-up returned. The night before the next workday involved preparation. Food had to be set aside for the morning. Clothing had to dry near the fire if it was wet. Boots had to be checked. Tools had to be placed where they could be found. A mother might pack dinner pails before bed or rise early to do it. A worker might count remaining coins and decide what could be bought tomorrow. Coal might be rationed. A child's cough might be listened to with worry. Someone might ask whether work was steady, whether overtime was coming, whether the mill was hiring, whether the union had news, whether the landlord had been paid. The next day entered the room before the present one was finished. There is a quiet cruelty in repeated exhaustion. One hard day can be survived with a story attached to it. You can tell yourself it was unusual, that rest will come, that tomorrow will be different. Industrial labour often removed that comfort. Tomorrow would not be different in any large way. The same gate, the same bell, the same dust, the same overseer, the same wage system, the same walk home. This repetition shaped character in some people, producing discipline, solidarity, toughness and pride. It also wore people down. A life can be shortened not only by one disaster but by thousands of ordinary days that ask slightly too much. Labour movements grew from this repetition. Workers did not organise only because of one bad day. Though one bad day could ignite action, they organised because the pattern became impossible to ignore. Long hours, low wages, dangerous conditions, fines, child labour, women's underpayment, unemployment, lack of compensation for injury, control over time. The daily return home with too little money and too little strength became political when workers began to see it not as private failure, but as a shared condition. Meetings after work were hard to attend because everyone was tired, and that is exactly why attending mattered. A person who gave an evening to a union meeting after a 12-hour shift was spending one of the few pieces of life not already claimed by the employer. Strikes brought the home and workplace together in a direct way. When workers stopped work, the consequences entered kitchens immediately. Food became uncertain, credit mattered, neighbours mattered. Women often played crucial roles in sustaining strikes, managing households under pressure, joining demonstrations, confronting strikebreakers, organising relief, and making the moral case for resistance. Children felt strikes in meals and tension, but also sometimes in excitement, marches, songs, and the presence of adults at home when they would normally be gone. A strike was not only an event at the factory gate, it was lived at the table. The end of the industrial workday therefore cannot be understood as a simple return from public labour to private life. The two were tied tightly together. Wages determined the home. The home prepared the worker for wages. Injuries crossed the threshold. Dust crossed the threshold. Fatigue crossed the threshold. So did pride, anger, friendship, skill, songs, politics, and hope. The industrial age did not create a clean line between factory and family. It created a loop. Wake in the home, walk to the factory, sell the day. Return with wages and exhaustion. Use the home to repair the worker enough to sell another day. That loop was the ordinary life of millions. And yet people inside that loop built lives that were not only defined by it. They named children, kept photographs, saved for furniture, joined choirs, attended weddings, mourned the dead, argued over politics, wrote letters, planted small gardens where space allowed, polished boots for Sunday, bought ribbons, read newspapers aloud, took pride in a clean doorstep, organised unions, learned instruments, courted in parks, cared for elderly parents, celebrated holidays and imagined better futures. This matters because the workers of the industrial age were not merely evidence in a case against industrial capitalism. They were full people. They were tired and they were inventive. They were exploited and they were capable. They suffered and they laughed. They were constrained by wages and they still made culture. Late in the evening the household begins to quiet. Not peacefully in every case, not neatly, but gradually. The youngest children fall asleep first if hunger, noise, or coughing allows it. Older children resist sleep or drop into it suddenly. A woman may still be mending, washing, planning, nursing, or setting things ready for morning. A man may sit with boots off, feet sore, hands rough, eyes closing before he admits he's tired. The fire burns low because fuel costs money. A lamp or candle is put out because light costs money too. The room darkens, and darkness in an industrial town is rarely complete. There may be a glow from furnaces, gas lamps in the street, factory windows, passing trains, or the red pulse of work continuing somewhere through the night. Industry does not sleep all at once. Some workers are just beginning as others lie down. The person in bed may still hear the factory in memory. Those who worked around machines often carried sound with them after leaving. The ears rang. The muscles repeated motions in small twitches. The mind replayed tasks, mistakes, warnings, and worries. Tomorrow's walk waited in the dark. The bell would ring again. The knocker-up would tap. The child would be shaken awake. The kettle would be set on. Boots would be pulled onto sore feet. Food would be packed if there was food to pack. The street would fill again with workers moving through smoke toward the places that bought their hours. If you look at a modern city tonight, at lit windows, late buses, people leaving offices, warehouses, hospitals, restaurants, factories, shops and stations, the industrial age is not as far away as it first appears. The machines have changed. Laws have changed. Many protections were won through struggle. Childhood is better protected in many parts of the world, though not everywhere. Wages, hours, safety rules, weekends, inspections, compensation, and unions all carry the imprint of those earlier workers who endured too much and then demanded limits. But the basic question they lived with has not disappeared. How much of a human life should work be allowed to take? How tired should a person be when they come home? What should wages be able to buy? Who gets protected first, and who is left waiting? Those questions were present in the dark streets outside the mills, in the dinner pails, in the pawn shops, in the coughing rooms, in the small coins counted on tables, and in the bodies lowering themselves into bed after a day measured by someone else's clock. The worker finally sleeps, not because everything is finished, but because the body has reached the end of what it can do. Around them the household rests as much as it is able. Clothes hang near the fire. The dinner pail waits to be filled again. The boots are near the door. Somewhere nearby a factory chimney continues to smoke into the night, and the town holds its breath only lightly, because before long the morning will begin again, and with it the same line of figures will appear in the dim streets, moving through cold air and cold smoke toward the bell.